We are going back 100 million years. Back to a world that existed long before the first human footstep, long before the first bird's song, long before the first flower opened its petals to a morning sun. We are going back to the middle of the Cretaceous period, to a world so different from our own that you would barely recognize the continents beneath your feet, the air you would breathe, or the creatures that moved through the shadows of a forest that had no name. And yet, in some quiet and fundamental way, it was still Earth, still our planet, still the same blue marble turning slowly in the dark of space, wrapped in its thin blanket of atmosphere, warmed by the same sun, just younger, wilder, more vast. Tonight, we're going to walk through that world together. We're going to feel the heat rising off ancient soil, watch rivers move through landscapes that no human eye has ever seen, and stand at the edge of warm, shallow seas teeming with life that has long since turned to stone. We are going to meet the giants and the small ones, the swimmers and the flyers, the patient hunters and the slow grazers. And I hope, somewhere along the way, you find yourself breathing a little slower, thinking a little less, letting the ancient world do what it has always done, remind us how vast and strange and beautiful existence really is. So settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let the world of 100 million years ago begin to unfold around you. If you enjoy listening to sleepy prehistoric dinosaur stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. Before we can understand what it felt like to be alive 100 million years ago, we need to understand the shape of the world itself, because the world did not look the way it does today, not even close. Right now, if you were to look down at Earth from space, you would see the familiar arrangement of continents, the angular bulk of the Americas on one side, the long curve of Europe and Africa on the other, Asia stretching wide across the top, Australia sitting quietly below. You would recognize it instantly. That map is built into our sense of home, but 100 million years ago that map did not exist. What existed instead was something older, stranger, and in its own way, more dramatic. The great supercontinent of Pangaea, which had once brought nearly all the world's land masses together into a single massive body, had been breaking apart for tens of millions of years by the time we arrive in our story. The process was slow, slower than anything we can intuitively grasp. A few centimeters per year, less than the rate at which your fingernails grow, and yet, over millions of years, those few centimeters become hundreds of miles. Mountains rise, oceans open, continents drift. By 100 million years ago, the world had split into two main landmasses. In the north, the ancient supercontinent of Laurasia, a vast expanse that held what would eventually become North America, Europe, and much of Asia. In the south, the equally ancient Gondwana, the great southern land that carried what would become South America, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, India, and Madagascar. And between them, and threading through them, the sea. The oceans of the Cretaceous were different from our own. Sea levels were dramatically higher, perhaps as much as 200 meters higher than they are today, though estimates vary. That may sound abstract, but consider what it means. At those sea levels, vast interior regions of the continents that are today dry land were submerged beneath warm, shallow seas. The middle of North America, for instance, was covered by a great inland waterway, the Western Interior Seaway, that stretched from what is now the Arctic all the way down to what is now the Gulf of Mexico, splitting the continent cleanly in two. It was not a narrow channel, it was a sea, a genuine expansive sea, hundreds of miles wide, warm and rich and teeming with life. I find this image genuinely difficult to hold in my mind. The idea that the centre of a continent I think of as solid, as permanent, as fundamentally dry, was once the floor of an ancient ocean. It's one of those facts that geology hands you quietly, almost gently, and then waits for the full weight of it to settle in. And Gondwana was breaking apart too during this period. India had already separated from Africa and was beginning its slow, northward drift toward Asia. A collision that, when it finally happened tens of millions of years later, would crumple the crust into the Himalayas. Antarctica and Australia were still connected to each other, still relatively close to the South Pole but not yet frozen. The world was warm enough that even polar regions supported forests. Africa was more isolated than it would later become, separated by shallow seas from Europe to the north and from South America to the west, though the South Atlantic was still young and narrow, a mere sliver of ocean compared to its eventual width. South America and Africa, though separating, were still close enough to share some wildlife. The Atlantic Ocean between them was young. Geologically speaking, it had barely been born. And yet already, the great slow migration of the life was underway. Species moving, adapting, evolving into new forms on their newly isolated continents. The shape of the land itself, the mountain ranges, the river systems, the plains, was equally different. The Rocky Mountains of North America, so central to our modern image of the American West, were just beginning to form during the Cretaceous, pushed upward by a process called the Laramide orogeny, as tectonic plates shifted beneath the continent. The Alps of Europe did not yet exist in any recognizable form. The Himalayas, as I mentioned, were still a collision waiting to happen. The world was geologically active in ways that were visible, dramatic, volcanoes rising and falling, new mountain ranges pushing up, old ones wearing slowly down. And through all of it, the slow, patient drift of the continents continued, a few centimeters per year, a few meters per century, a few miles per million years. And yet the world was being completely remade. There is something quietly humbling about this, about the realization that the map we carry in our heads, the one we learned in school, the one we see on globes and atlases and weather maps, is not a fact about the universe, but a snapshot. A single frozen frame from a film that has been running for 4.5 billion years and shows no sign of stopping. The continents we know are not destinations, they are waypoints. The world is still moving right now beneath our feet at the slow and patient pace of deep time. But let us return to the Cretaceous. Let us look more closely at the climate of this world, because the climate, more than almost anything else, is what determined what kinds of life could exist, where they could live, and what their days and nights felt like. The Cretaceous was warm, genuinely, deeply, profoundly warm, warmer than today's world by a significant margin. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels were several times higher than they are now, and the resulting greenhouse effect kept average global temperatures elevated. There were no polar ice caps, or if there were, they were small and seasonal rather than the permanent massive structures we know today. The Arctic and Antarctic regions, while certainly experiencing dark winters and reduced sunlight for part of the year, were temperate enough to support forests. There were polar dinosaurs, polar forests, polar crocodilians, which today can only survive in tropical climates. The tropics by extension were extraordinarily hot and humid, not uninhabitable. Life was there in abundance, but intense. The kind of wet, dense, steaming heat that you can perhaps imagine if you have ever stood at the edge of a tropical rainforest on a summer afternoon, the air so thick with moisture that it feels almost like water, the sound of insects and birds filling every available frequency. Now imagine that amplified, sustained, running across vast swaths of the tropical latitudes for millions of years. The mid-latitudes, the regions corresponding roughly to where temperate zones exist today, were warm and relatively mild by Cretaceous standards, though still warmer than modern equivalents. Forests were extensive, inland seas, moderated temperatures in the continental interiors. Seasonal variation existed, but without the sharp cold winters that define much of the modern temperate experience. In this warmer world, a phenomenon that geologists call eustacy, the rise and fall of global sea levels, played a constant role in shaping the coastlines and ecosystems. Sea levels were not static. They rose and fell over millions of years in response to changes in ocean floor spreading rates, volcanic activity, and the amount of water locked up in ice. During the Cretaceous, with little permanent ice, the primary driver of sea level change was the rate at which new ocean floor was being created at mid-ocean ridges. When ridges were active and spreading fast, they displaced more water, pushing sea levels up. When activity slowed, sea levels fell. The result was a world where coastlines were never quite fixed, where the line between land and sea shifted over geological time, where islands appeared and disappeared and reappeared. It is a world that would have been recognizable as a planet. Gravity, air, water, light. But nothing else would feel familiar. The sky above, the ground below, the sounds in the air, the creatures moving through the undergrowth, all of it would be deeply, profoundly alien, and yet alive, bursting with it. Humming with the energy of millions of species going about their ancient business. That is the world we have arrived in. That is the stage on which tonight's story unfolds. Let us talk about the air. Because the air of 100 million years ago was not quite the same air we breathe tonight. The fundamental chemistry was similar. Nitrogen dominated as it does today, making up roughly 3/4 of the atmosphere. Oxygen was present in roughly similar proportions to today, though estimates vary, and there is ongoing scientific debate about exactly how oxygen levels fluctuated through the Cretaceous period. Some researchers have proposed that oxygen may have been slightly lower during parts of the Cretaceous. Others suggest it was comparable to or slightly higher than today's levels. The honest answer is that we don't know with certainty, and I find that uncertainty oddly beautiful. This evidence of how much we still don't fully know about our own planet's past. What we do know with greater confidence is the carbon dioxide story. Atmospheric CO2 during the Cretaceous was dramatically higher than it is today, perhaps 4 to 8 times higher, depending on the period and the proxy measurements used. This elevated CO2 was the primary driver of the Cretaceous greenhouse climate, trapping solar energy within the atmosphere and keeping global temperatures elevated across the planet. And this had consequences for life that went far beyond simple temperature. Higher CO2 levels meant that plants, which use carbon dioxide as their primary raw material in photosynthesis, had access to a richer, more abundant supply of their essential nutrient. Plants in a high CO2 world tend to grow more vigorously. Though the full ecological picture is complex, the forests of the Cretaceous were dense and productive in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. But perhaps the most significant atmospheric story of the Cretaceous, the one that would have the most lasting consequences for our world today, involves not the air directly, but the plants that were breathing it. The flowering plants, the angiosperms, were in the process of one of the most important evolutionary events in the history of life on Earth. Before the Cretaceous, the dominant land plants were gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, ginkgos, ferns. These were ancient, successful, widespread plants, and they dominated the Cretaceous landscape in many regions. But something new was happening. Sometime in the early Cretaceous, perhaps 130 or 140 million years ago, the first flowering plants appeared. By 100 million years ago, our moment in this story, they were already diversifying rapidly, though they had not yet achieved the total dominance over the world's vegetation that they would eventually reach. In some ecosystems, they remained minority players, growing in disturbed areas along riverbanks and floodplains, in the margins and gaps of the older gymnosperm forests. In others, they were becoming significant components of the plant community, and they were doing something revolutionary. Flowering plants had evolved a fundamentally new relationship with other living things. Instead of relying solely on wind to carry their pollen, the ancient imprecise method of the gymnosperms, many flowering plants were forming partnerships with animals, insects primarily. Flowers were advertisements, nectar was a reward. In exchange for visiting flowers, insects inadvertently carried pollen from one plant to another, allowing fertilization to occur with a precision and efficiency that wine pollination could never match. This mutual dependence, this ancient contract between flowers and the insects that visit them, was beginning to reshape the world 100 million years ago. It would take tens of millions of more years to fully play out, but the process was underway. The insects were changing. Bees, butterflies, and moths were diversifying alongside the flowers they depended on. The ecology of the land surface was being gradually rewritten. I sometimes think about this when I look at a garden, at the bees moving from flower to flower, following pathways of scent and colour that were laid down in evolutionary time. That relationship, that intimate, wordless partnership, began in the Cretaceous. It is older than the mammals, older than the birds as we know them. It is one of the oldest ongoing conversations on the planet. The weather of the Cretaceous, driven by its warm and CO2-rich atmosphere, was also different in character from what we experience today. Without polar ice caps to drive the strong atmospheric pressure gradients that power much of our modern weather, the circulation patterns of the Cretaceous atmosphere were less vigorous in some ways, more persistent in others. The polar jet streams that dominate so much of mid-latitude weather in today's world would have been weaker or differently configured. Monsoon systems existed. The basic mechanism of monsoons, driven by differential heating between land and sea, is ancient, but their patterns and intensities would have been shaped by the different geography of the Cretaceous world. The vast interior seas that existed on the continents moderated temperatures and provided enormous sources of evaporation, fueling precipitation over land areas that today are dry. Hurricanes and tropical cyclones almost certainly existed, driven by the warm tropical oceans that provided their energy. But the patterns of their formation and the tracks they followed would have been shaped by the different geography of the oceans and continents. In a world without the Atlantic as we know it, without the Gulf of Mexico in its modern form, without the Caribbean archipelago, the paths of tropical storms would have been unrecognizable, and rain. Let us think for a moment about rain in the Cretaceous. With warm oceans covering more of the planet's surface, with vast areas of shallow inland sea evaporating into the atmosphere, with the water cycle running at a higher temperature and therefore higher intensity, precipitation patterns across the Cretaceous continents were likely intense in many regions. Forests that today would be dry were probably regularly drenched. Rivers that today run intermittently through semi-arid landscapes may have been perennial, fed by reliable seasonal rains. This constant cycling of water through the atmosphere, through the soil, through the rivers and into the seas and back again, this great circulatory system of the planet, ran hotter and faster and wetter in the Cretaceous than it does today. And life responded to it, grew within it, was shaped by it over millions of years until the creatures of that world were perfectly, exquisitely adapted to a climate that no longer exists, which is, when I sit with it quietly, one of the more melancholy thoughts I can have about the natural world. All of that adaptation, all of those millions of years of slow, patient fine-tuning between creature and climate, and then the asteroid, and all of it, undone. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We are still in the warm and living world of 100 million years ago. Let us stay here a while longer. The oceans of the Cretaceous were alive in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. Start with the water itself. Warmer than today, with no polar ice to chill the deep currents that carry cold water from the poles toward the tropics, the Cretaceous oceans were globally warmer. The temperature difference between tropical surface waters and deep ocean water was less pronounced than today, which had significant effects on ocean circulation patterns. Upwelling, the process by which cold, nutrient-rich water rises from the deep ocean to the surface, was likely less vigorous in some regions, though more active in others due to the different geometry of the ocean basins. But life does not require a particular temperature. Life requires conditions. And the Cretaceous oceans, whatever their temperature regime, were extraordinarily productive. Let us begin with the very small, because the very small built the foundation of everything else. The Cretaceous seas were dominated, in terms of sheer abundance and ecological importance, by microscopic organisms called coccolithophores. These tiny single-celled algae, each one smaller than a grain of fine sand, had evolved the remarkable ability to build tiny shells of calcium carbonate around themselves. These shells, called coccoliths, were intricate, beautiful structures of extraordinary geometric precision, rings and discs and wheels of white mineral, assembled by cells with no nervous system, no brain, no intention, nothing but the patient execution of ancient biochemical instructions. And when the coccolithophores died, as all living things eventually do, their shells sank. Slowly, over enormous time, the shells accumulated on the ocean floor in layers of extraordinary thickness. Those layers became limestone. Some of them became chalk. The white cliffs of Dover, the chalky plains of Kansas and Nebraska and Texas, the great limestone formations that geologists find across the world, these are the graveyards of Cretaceous coccolithophores. The name Cretaceous itself comes from the Latin for chalk, Creta, an entire geological period named for the microscopic remains of tiny algae. I find this one of the most quietly astonishing facts in all of natural history. That the substance we use to write on blackboards, that the white cliffs that stand at the edge of England were built by organisms so small that you could fit thousands of them on the head of a pin. Life at its most fundamental, at its most microscopic, building geological monuments. In the surface waters of the Cretaceous oceans, coccolithophores were joined by other microscopic plankton. Foraminifera with their own calcium carbonate shells, diatoms building frameworks of silica, cyanobacteria fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere, and countless other tiny organisms cycling nutrients through the water column. This microscopic community formed the base of a food web of staggering complexity and productivity, and that productivity supported animals of extraordinary scale. The seas of the Cretaceous were patrolled by some of the most impressive marine predators that have ever existed. The ichthyosaurs, dolphin-shaped reptiles that had dominated the Mesozoic ocean since the Triassic, were in their twilight by 100 million years ago, and would go extinct before the end of the Cretaceous, replaced by newer, perhaps more competitive groups. The plesiosaurs, by contrast, were in their prime. Plesiosaurs came in two basic body plans that had evolved early in their history and proved so successful that they persisted largely unchanged for tens of millions of years. The first type, the plesiosaurs in the strict sense, had long serpentine necks, small heads, and compact bodies supported by four large paddle-like flippers. Some species had necks that were extraordinarily long, longer than their bodies in some cases, and scientists have long debated exactly how these animals used such extravagant anatomical investments. Were the necks used to reach down into seagrass beds, grazing on soft vegetation? Were they used to hunt fish in shallow waters, snaking the head through schools of prey before they could flee? The debate continues, and I find the uncertainty genuinely delightful, a reminder that these animals were real, complex, behaviourally rich creatures that we are still working to understand. The second type, the pliosaurs, took a very different approach, shorter-necked, larger-headed, with massive, powerful jaws built for grasping large, fast-moving prey. Some pliosaurs grew to extraordinary sizes, 12, 15 metres, perhaps more. Their skulls alone could be 2 or 3 metres in length, armed with interlocking conical teeth of fearsome design. These were apex predators of the open ocean, competing with the largest sharks and fish for dominance of the marine food web. And speaking of fish, the Cretaceous seas were full of them. Not the bony fish of our modern oceans in their complete modern diversity, but remarkable ancestral forms that laid the groundwork for what was to come. There were enormous fish too. Zephactinus was a predatory fish of the western interior seaway that could reach 6 metres in length, a silvery, powerful creature with a protruding lower jaw and rows of sharp teeth, more than capable of taking prey almost as large as itself. The mosasaurs, which we will explore more later, were an additional layer of marine predation, large, secondarily aquatic lizards that had taken to the sea during the Cretaceous and evolved into some of the most effective marine hunters the planet has ever seen. By the late Cretaceous, some mosasaurs were over 15 metres long, true monsters of the deep, but let us not dwell only on the large. The Cretaceous oceans were also full of the delicate and the quiet. Ammonites, cephalopods related to today's nautilus, their bodies coiled within beautifully spiraled shells, were present in extraordinary diversity. Hundreds of species, ranging from coin-sized to automobile-sized, each species with its own distinctive pattern of shell coiling, its own chamber arrangement, its own ecological role. They floated and swam in the midwater, using jet propulsion to move with surprising speed, hunting small prey with their tentacles and beaked mouths. The ammonites had been around for hundreds of millions of years by the time of our story, and they had survived multiple mass extinctions, adapting and diversifying in the aftermath of each catastrophe. They were, in a sense, survivors by profession, and yet in the end even they could not survive what was coming. They would be among the casualties of the end Cretaceous extinction, leaving behind only their beautiful shells in the rock, to be found by curious humans millions of years later and puzzled over for centuries. Ancient turtles occupied the shallow coastal waters and inland seas, some of them enormous by modern standards. Archelon, one of the largest turtles ever known to exist, lived in the western interior seaway and could reach over 4 metres in length, with a wingspan of comparable size if you include its flippers. It was not a fast creature, nor an especially aggressive one. It seems to have fed primarily on jellyfish and soft-bodied prey, cruising slowly through the warm water with the unhurried confidence of an animal, with no natural predators large enough to threaten it. And beneath all of this, in the dark of the deep ocean, Life of a different kind went about its patient business. Bacteria and archaea recycling the organic matter that drifted down from the sunlit surface. Bottom-dwelling invertebrates filtering the water for particles of food. Ancient sea urchins and bivalves working through the sediment. The deep ocean has always been its own world, separate and dark and governed by its own rules. The coastlines of the Cretaceous were rich and complex environments, delta systems where great rivers met the sea, spreading their sediment loads in broad fans, building new land from the debris of eroded mountains, shallow lagoons and tidal flats, warm and rich with life, coral reefs, different in their species composition from modern reefs but performing the same fundamental role of building complex. Three-dimensional habitat from calcium carbonate. Mangrove-like communities of coastal vegetation, stabilizing shorelines and providing nursery habitat for juvenile fish. There is something in this description that I find oddly peaceful. The idea of standing at the edge of a Cretaceous coastline, the warm air, the sound of gentle waves on a beach that no human foot had ever touched, the occasional splash of a creature moving in the shallows, the cries of pterosaurs overhead, the world going about its ancient business with a kind of unhurried completeness that is hard to imagine in our own frantic age. Let yourself imagine it for a moment, the edge of a warm, shallow sea, the air heavy with salt and the faint sweetness of growing things, the light on the water, the sound of your own breathing. Slow and steady in the heat of an ancient afternoon. Now let us step away from the shore and move inland. Let us enter the forests and floodplains and open landscapes of the Cretaceous continents. Let us find the giants, because they were there. Oh, they were very much there. The dinosaurs had been the dominant large vertebrates on land for more than 60 million years by our moment in the Cretaceous. They had risen from the wreckage of the Triassic extinction, diversified explosively through the Jurassic, and by 100 million years ago had spread to every continent and occupied nearly every large-bodied ecological niche that the land had to offer. They were not the sluggish, tail-dragging monsters of early popular imagination. They were dynamic, diverse, behaviourally complex animals, some warm-blooded or at least capable of elevated metabolic rates, some highly social, some equipped with feathers, some with horns and frills of extraordinary elaboration, some equipped with weapons of terrifying effectiveness. Let us begin with the largest, because the largest of the Cretaceous dinosaurs were the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed, barrel-bodied herbivores that represent the absolute peak of terrestrial body size in the history of life on Earth. By 100 million years ago, the sauropods were represented primarily by a group called the Titanosaurs, a spectacularly diverse clade of long-necked giants that would persist until the very end of the Cretaceous. The Titanosaurs ranged in size from creatures comparable to a large modern elephant to the largest animals that have ever walked on land. Patagutitan majorum, discovered in Argentina and described in 2017, is one of the largest dinosaurs ever found. Its weight is estimated at around 60 to 70 metric tons. Its length at approximately 37 meters. To stand next to such an animal would be to feel genuinely small in a way that modern life rarely provides. The titanosaurs of 100 million years ago occupied the great southern landmass of Gondwana with particular abundance. In what is now South America and Africa, these giants moved through forests and along riverbanks, their long necks allowing them to reach vegetation both high and low. Though the exact feeding ecology of specific titanosaurs is still actively debated. Some researchers have argued that very long-necked sauropods held their necks primarily in a low sweeping position, clearing wide arcs of low vegetation like enormous living lawnmowers. Others suggest that neck raising was possible and used to reach the high branches of tall trees, similar to the behaviour of modern giraffes. What is certain is that feeding an animal of this size required an almost constant intake of food. An animal weighing 60 or 70 tons, maintaining normal metabolic processes, requires an extraordinary amount of energy. Some estimates suggest that the largest sauropods needed to consume hundreds of kilograms of plant material per day. The sheer scale of their consumption must have shaped the ecosystems around them, opening gaps in forests, creating pathways through dense vegetation, dispersing seeds in their droppings across enormous distances. And when they moved, the ground must have trembled. Not dramatically, not like an earthquake, but with a low, felt vibration that you would have sensed through your feet before you heard it. The footfall of a 70-ton animal is not subtle. Fossilized trackways of sauropods have been found across the world, and even in stone. They communicate something of the scale and weight of these creatures. Deep impressions, metre wide or more, with a stride length that could be several metres. The weight of the world's largest animal, preserved forever in ancient mud. Alongside the titanosaurs, other dinosaur groups had diversified into every available role. The ornithopods, bipedal and quadrupedal plant eaters with complex tooth batteries designed for grinding tough vegetation, were widespread and successful across both Laurasia and Gondwana. Some ornithopods were large animals in their own right, several metres long, living in herds that may have numbered in the hundreds. Their fossil trackways sometimes preserve evidence of mass movements, dozens or hundreds of individuals moving together across mud flats, their tracks overlapping and crisscrossing in evidence of communal life. And then there were the hunters. The theropod dinosaurs, as the bipedal carnivores that form the evolutionary lineage leading eventually to modern birds, were at the peak of their Cretaceous diversity and ecological dominance. On the great southern continents, the abelisaurids were among the dominant large predators, stocky, deep-skulled carnivores with relatively short arms and powerful legs. Carnotaurus, found in Argentina, is perhaps the most visually striking of the group, its skull adorned with two prominent horns above the eyes that give it an appearance unlike any other dinosaur, slightly absurd to modern eyes perhaps, but undeniably formidable in life. On the northern continents, the tyrannosaurs were beginning their rise, though the true giants of the tyrannosaur lineage, Tyrannosaurus rex itself, would not appear until the very end of the Cretaceous. At 100 million years ago, the tyrannosaurs were present, but were medium-sized predators rather than the apex hunters they would later become. That top predator role in Laurasia was occupied at this time by other groups, the allosaur relatives, the spinosaurs in their range, the Carcharodontosaurs across much of Gondwana. Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, the shark-toothed lizard of the Sahara, was one of the largest land predators of its time. Found in what is now North Africa, this animal could reach 12 to 14 metres in length and may have weighed 6 or 7 metric tons. Its teeth were long, laterally flattened and serrated on both edges, designed not for crunching bone like the later tyrannosaurs, but for slicing through flesh, the way a steak knife slices through meat. This was a precision cutting instrument attached to a massive, powerful skull. Whatever it hunted, it was not subtle about the process, and yet, and this is something that I think about when I contemplate these animals, the largest predators are always constrained by the ecology of the world they inhabit. Carcharodontosaurus did not hunt alone across empty plains. It existed within an ecosystem, dependent on the prey species available, limited by competition with other predators, constrained by the need for water and suitable habitat. Even the mightiest predator that ever walked the land was in the end an animal embedded in a web of ecological relationships as complex and as fragile as any other. The hunters and the hunted, the eaters and the eaten. The ancient drama of the food web playing out across landscapes that stretched from horizon to horizon with no human eye to witness it. Let us sit with that image for a moment. The vast, untouched wilderness of the Cretaceous world, the forests humming with life in every layer from the roots to the canopy, the rivers running clear and warm through floodplains where titanosaurs graze and ornithopods browse. And somewhere in the shadows, the patient, unhurried movement of a predator with a 12-metre body and the cold, focused attention of an animal that has eaten this way for millions of years. Not frightening exactly, more like deeply natural, the world operating according to its own ancient logic, without sentiment, without cruelty, without any of the values we project onto it. Just life, in all its complexity, going about its timeless work. Of all the predators that walked the Cretaceous world, one of the most remarkable, and one of the most recently and dramatically reinterpreted, is Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. And I want to spend some time with this animal, because its story is not just a story about a dinosaur. It is a story about discovery and revision, and the humbling realization that nature is always more creative than our imaginations. Spinosaurus was first described in 1915 by the German paleontologist Ernst Stromer von Reichenbach, based on fossils recovered from the Bahariya Formation of Egypt. The original fossils were remarkable. Partial skull bones, vertebrae with enormously elongated neural spines forming the iconic sail of the animal, limb bones. Stromer's description established Spinosaurus as a large theropod with a distinctive sail on its back, the purpose of which was, and in some respects still is, debated. Those original fossils were destroyed during World War II, when Allied bombing raids struck the Munich museum where they were stored. For decades, Spinosaurus was known primarily from Stromer's original descriptions and illustrations, a ghost dinosaur whose bones had been literally obliterated by history. Then new material began to emerge from North Africa, from Morocco, from Egypt, from the Kem Formation that preserves the ancient river delta ecosystem of 100 million years ago. And what that new material revealed was an animal even stranger than anyone had imagined. A partial skeleton described in 2014, combined with more recent discoveries, has painted a picture of Spinosaurus that is genuinely revolutionary. This was not simply a very large sail-backed version of a typical large theropod. Spinosaurus was deeply, fundamentally weird in ways that suggest it occupied a completely different ecological niche from other large dinosaurs. Consider the body. The legs of Spinosaurus were relatively small and weak compared to the massive torso, not the powerful running limbs of a Tyrannosaurus or Allosaurus, but more compact, more adapted for use in water than on dry land. The hind feet were broad, with long, elongated toes that may have been webbed or at least functionally similar to the feet of diving birds. The tail, and this is perhaps the most dramatic discovery in recent years, was tall and flexible, with elongated neural spines that formed what appears to have been an effective swimming surface. Not a rigid fin, but an undulating paddle-like structure that would have propelled the animal through water the way a crocodile's tail propels it today. The skull was long, low, and narrow, a profile very similar to a gharial, the long-snouted crocodilian of the Indian subcontinent that specializes in catching fish. The teeth were conical and interlocking, not the blade-like teeth of a flesh-slicing predator, but the spike-like teeth of a fish catcher. Isotope analysis of Spinosaurus teeth suggests that this animal consumed a diet heavy in aquatic prey, the chemical signature of a semi-aquatic lifestyle preserved in the mineral structure of the teeth themselves. Put all of this together and you get a picture of an animal unlike anything in the modern world. Spinosaurus was, according to the most current evidence, the world's first known semi-aquatic dinosaur, an enormous predator that spent significant time in the water, hunting fish and other aquatic prey. Possibly wading in shallow waters and plunging that long, narrow skull below the surface in pursuit of prey. The sail on its back, rising from the water's surface as the animal moved through a river or shallow delta, must have been an extraordinary sight. The Kem ecosystem, the river system in which Spinosaurus lived, was itself one of the most dangerous and ecologically intense environments in the entire Cretaceous world. The rivers of the Kem, which flowed through what is now Morocco and Algeria, were home to an extraordinary concentration of large predators. Carcharodontosaurus walked the banks. Enormous crocodilian relatives, some of them 10 or 15 meters long, inhabited the waterways. Giant sawfish with their toothed rostra cut through schools of fish in the current. Enormous coelacanth-like fish patrolled the deeper channels, and over all of them, in its extraordinary semi-aquatic specialization, moved Spinosaurus. At perhaps 15 or 16 meters in length, it was among the largest land predators of all time, heavier than a Tyrannosaurus rex. Though probably less suited to pure terrestrial confrontation, a specialist, adapted to its world with the precision that long evolutionary time produces in living things. I find myself returning again and again to the image of this animal standing in a shallow river, the water up to its massive shoulders, the long skull extended, the nostrils somewhere near the tip of the snout positioned above the waterline, while the rest of the skull was submerged, hunting, patient, efficient. The world's largest fishing dinosaur performing a task that crocodilians still perform today, in their much smaller way. There is a continuity there, across 100 million years. The broad outlines of the strategy, enter the water, use a long snout and spiked teeth to catch fish, are still visible in the world today. The specific animal is gone, but the ecological role, the niche, the adaptation, these things persist. Life finds the same solutions over and over again. The rivers of the Kem eventually gave way to broader floodplains and deltic systems, as they approached the ancient sea that then occupied what is now the Sahara Desert. And it is worth pausing for a moment to absorb that geographical inversion. The vast, hot desert that today is perhaps the most forbidding landscape on Earth was, 100 million years ago, a lush, river-threaded, life-filled ecosystem. The sands that today are the Sahara contain fossils of river fish and crocodilians and dinosaurs. The great empty desert is built on the bones of a living world. Let the vastness of that transformation settle into your mind. The Sahara, green and alive and full of rivers. Spinosaurus wading through waters that are today buried under meters of sand. Time enough to turn a rainforest into a desert. Time enough to do anything. Let us lift our eyes from the rivers and floodplains, away from the massive feet of the sauropods and the tracks of the hunting theropods, and look upward. Because the air of the Cretaceous world was not empty. The pterosaurs had been the masters of Mesozoic skies since the Triassic, and by 100 million years ago they had evolved into some of the most spectacular flying animals the world has ever seen. Not birds, though birds were present too in their early experimental forms. Pterosaurs were something else entirely. Reptiles that had independently evolved the ability to fly, through a completely different anatomical solution than the one birds had arrived at. Where a bird's wing is built from modified arm bones supporting a fan of feathers, a pterosaur's wing was a membrane stretched between an enormously elongated fourth finger and the animal's body and hind legs. A single finger, enlarged to extraordinary length, serving as the entire leading edge and structural support of the wing. It is an unlikely architecture, and yet it worked. It worked for more than 160 million years. The pterosaurs of the Cretaceous were diverse in the extreme. At the small end were creatures comparable in size to modern birds, insectivores and fish catchers that fluttered and swooped through the spaces between the trees, or dove into shallow water for small aquatic prey. Some had crests of various elaborate forms, bony projections from the back of the skull, sometimes larger than the skull itself, apparently used for display or species recognition. Some were covered in a hair-like fibrous integument called pycnofibers, not feathers, but something functionally similar, an insulating coat that suggests at least some pterosaurs maintained elevated body temperatures. But at the large end, and the large end was very large indeed, the Cretaceous pterosaurs reached body sizes that still provoke genuine astonishment. The Ajdarcid pterosaurs, a group that appears in the fossil record by the mid-Cretaceous, would eventually produce Quetzalcoatlus northropi, a species from the very end of the Cretaceous that had a wingspan of up to 10 or 11 meters. Standing on the ground, it would have been as tall as a modern giraffe. Flying, it would have been visible from an enormous distance. A creature so large that it is genuinely difficult to understand how it managed to get airborne at all. The mechanics of pterosaur flight in the largest species have been a subject of intense scientific debate. How did a 10-meter wingspan animal, weighing perhaps 200 kilograms or more, take off from the ground? The proposed solution, based on recent biomechanical studies, is a dramatic four-limbed vault. The pterosaur using all four limbs to push itself upward and backward simultaneously, launching its body into the air with enough initial velocity to get its massive wings generating lift. Not a graceful ballet of a takeoff, more like a muscular explosion. But it would have worked. Once aloft, the largest pterosaurs were likely extraordinary flyers, efficient, soaring over enormous distances on those vast wings, scanning the landscape below for prey or carrion. Some Ajdarcids appear to have been terrestrial stalkers rather than water-diving specialists, walking across open ground on all four limbs with a gait that would have been uniquely their own, spearing small prey, lizards, small dinosaurs, perhaps eggs and hatchlings, with their long, toothless beaks. Alongside the pterosaurs in the Cretaceous skies were the birds, though calling them birds, in the modern sense, requires some nuance. The early Cretaceous birds were a diverse and experimentally varied group, many of them still retaining teeth, a character inherited from their dinosaurian ancestors, and one that modern birds have entirely lost. They had not yet achieved the dominance in aerial ecosystems that they would later reach. Many ecological niches in the Cretaceous air were still occupied by pterosaurs, and the birds of this time were filling roles somewhat differently from how their descendants would fill them. The Enantiornithines, a major group of Cretaceous birds, were a particular success story of this time. Perching birds, mostly small to medium-sized, They occupied forested environments across the world and appear to have been abundant and diverse. Their feet were adapted for gripping branches, a familiar modern-feeling adaptation. Some had crests, some had elaborate tail feathers. They were real birds in all the ways that matter. And the forests of the Cretaceous rang with their calls. And it is here that I allow myself a small and quiet wonder, that the air of 100 million years ago was full of bird calls, that the very sound, that fundamental music of morning and evening in a world with trees, was already present. Different species, different songs, but the basic phenomenon of small-bodied, warm-blooded, feathered creatures greeting the dawn with sound, that was already in the world, already woven into the texture of existence. I don't know why that comforts me as much as it does. Maybe because it suggests that the world has, in some deep way, been tending toward this kind of richness for a very long time. Above the tree canopy, thermals rose from sun-heated ground and water surfaces, and into these thermals the larger pterosaurs lifted themselves for effortless soaring. A sufficiently large pterosaur, once aloft, could probably cover enormous distances with minimal active flapping, gliding on its vast membrane wings, tilting and banking with small adjustments of its body and tail, scanning the landscape below with eyes that were probably large, sophisticated, and capable of seeing colour. The view from a pterosaur's cruising altitude would have been extraordinary. Forests stretching to every horizon, broken by rivers that caught the light and flashed silver in the sun, the vast reflective surfaces of inland seas, the smoke of distant volcanic activity, herds of sauropods moving across floodplains, their massive bodies leaving tracks in the soft ground that would still be visible, turned to stone 100 million years later. All of it spread out below, wild and vast and full of life. We have spent considerable time with the large and the dramatic, with the giants whose bones have been found and named and placed in museums, with the predators and the vast creatures whose very footsteps trembled the ground. But the Cretaceous world, like any world, was made of small things as much as large ones, perhaps more so. And tonight, before we move further through the landscape of this ancient time, I want to stop and pay attention to the overlooked, the ones whose smallness made them easy to miss, but whose importance to the functioning of the world was every bit as significant as the giants they lived among. Let us begin with the insects. By 100 million years ago, insects had already been present on Earth for nearly 300 million years. They had survived every mass extinction, adapted to every climate, colonized every available habitat. They had been flying through the air since the Carboniferous, far longer than any vertebrate has been capable of flight. And in the Cretaceous, they were everywhere. The amber of the Cretaceous period, tree resin that hardened and preserved whatever it trapped as it solidified over millions of years, has given us a window into the insect world of this time that is uniquely detailed and intimate. Burmese amber, deposited in what is now Myanmar approximately 100 million years ago, has yielded tens of thousands of insect specimens preserved in extraordinary detail, beetles with their wing cases intact, ants, and yes, ants already existed in the Cretaceous, though early forms were different from modern ants. Midges and flies frozen in the act of movement. Parasitoid wasps with their slender bodies and delicate wings. Ticks that had recently fed, their bodies swollen with blood. And here I should address the question that I suspect is forming in the back of some minds, the Jurassic Park question, the DNA question. The idea of recovering dinosaur DNA from blood-feeding insects preserved in amber is a wonderful piece of science fiction, and it has captured imaginations in a way that very few scientific concepts have managed. The reality, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, depending on how you feel about the biosafety implications, is more constrained. DNA is a fragile molecule. It breaks down over time, attacked by water, by oxygen, by radiation, by the chemistry of the very biological processes it encodes. 100 million years is simply too long. The DNA of organisms preserved in Cretaceous amber, while the organisms themselves may be exquisitely preserved in their three-dimensional form, has degraded beyond recovery. The information is gone. The shell, the extraordinary, beautiful, perfectly preserved shell, remains. But the code that built the creature is lost. This is, in a way, the central tragedy and beauty of the fossil record. The forms are preserved, but life itself, The biochemistry, the behaviour, the ecology in all its dynamic complexity must be inferred, reconstructed, imagined from the silent evidence of stone and resin, and the careful reasoning of scientists who spend their careers learning to read what the rock remembers. But back to the insects, because the insects of the Cretaceous were more than just fascinating specimens in amber. They were the engine of the ecosystem. They were the decomposers breaking down dead plant material and returning nutrients to the soil. They were the pollinators beginning their ancient partnership with the first flowering plants. They were the prey that supported an enormous diversity of insectivorous vertebrates. They were the parasites and disease vectors that shaped the health and evolution of their hosts. They were the ants and termites that would eventually become the great soil engineers and nutrient cyclers of terrestrial ecosystems. And they were abundant, unimaginably abundant, by any standard we might apply. The sheer biomass of insects in the Cretaceous world across all its ecosystems almost certainly dwarfed the biomass of all the large vertebrates combined. This is probably true of the world today too. The small, the numerous, and the often ignored outweigh the large and the conspicuous in total ecological significance. Now let us find the mammals. I say this with some irony, because finding the mammals of the Cretaceous world is genuinely difficult, not because they didn't exist, but because they were, for the most part, very small. Most of the mammals of the Cretaceous were no larger than a modern rat or squirrel. They occupied the dark margins of a world dominated by dinosaurs, living primarily in burrows or in the trees, active primarily at night when their warm-blooded metabolism and large complex ears gave them advantages over the cold-dependent reptiles. The mammals of this time were part of a long and patient waiting story. Their lineage had actually diverged from the reptile family tree in the Triassic, almost as early as the dinosaurs themselves. But where the dinosaurs had seized the opportunity and expanded to fill ecological role after ecological role in the terrestrial landscape, the early mammals had remained constrained. Something, perhaps direct competition with the dinosaurs, perhaps ecological factors we don't fully understand, kept them small, kept them in the margins for more than 150 million years, and in those margins they were evolving, slowly, quietly, patiently. Their brains were enlarging relative to their body size. Their sensory capabilities, particularly hearing and smell, were developing in ways that the dominant dinosaurs were not matching. Their reproductive strategies were diversifying. The therian mammals, the lineage that would eventually give rise to marsupials and placental mammals, were already present, with their characteristic pattern of live birth and prolonged parental investment. Other mammal groups were exploring different reproductive and ecological strategies. The mammals of the Cretaceous were not, in any ecological sense, waiting to take over. They had no awareness of the future. They were simply living their small, warm, night-flavoured lives in the margins of a world that belonged, in all its vast and obvious ways, to the dinosaurs. But the night belonged to the mammals. And in the Cretaceous night, among the sounds of insects and the occasional distant call of a pterosaur, the small furred bodies of our distant ancestors moved through the undergrowth, their warm breath fogging slightly in the cool of the small hours, their whiskers reading the air for information, their large dark eyes gathering whatever light remained. A kind reminder to not forget to subscribe to keep the channel alive. I find something deeply touching in this image, in the knowledge that we, all of us, every human being who's ever lived, are the descendants of those small, marginal, apparently insignificant creatures, that the entire human story was carried for 150 million years in the warm bodies of animals no bigger than your hand, scurrying through the undergrowth while the giants thundered past. Resilience has many forms. Sometimes it looks like a 40-ton titanosaur, and sometimes it looks like a small, scared, bright-eyed creature in the dark, waiting out the long Cretaceous night. Let us return to the water. Specifically, let us travel to one of the most remarkable marine environments in the history of North America, the Western Interior Seaway. I mentioned this body of water briefly earlier, but it deserves more than a mention. It deserves the full weight of attention that we can give it, because it was one of the great defining features of the Cretaceous world, and the life it supported was extraordinary. Picture, if you can, a shallow sea stretching from the Arctic Ocean in the north to the Gulf of Mexico in the south, a distance of roughly 3,000 miles. At its widest, this inland sea was perhaps 1,000 miles from shore to shore, occupying the low-lying interior of North America in a vast, warm, sunlit expanse. To the west, the young Rocky Mountains rose in their jagged new forms. To the east, the ancient low plains of what is now the eastern United States descended gradually to the sea's far shore, and in between, water. Warm, shallow, productive water. The salinity of the western interior seaway was likely somewhat variable. It was connected to both the Arctic Ocean in the north and the warm Proto-Gulf in the south, and the mixing of these different water masses, combined with freshwater input from the rivers draining the western mountains, created a range of salinity gradients. Different zones of the seaway likely supported different ecological communities, the way estuaries and bays and open ocean today support very different assemblages of life. In these waters, the mosasaurs were at their zenith. These remarkable animals, secondarily aquatic lizards, more closely related to modern monitor lizards than to anything else alive today, had evolved into the dominant large predators of the late Cretaceous seas. Different mosasaur species occupied different ecological roles. Some were generalist predators, hunting fish and cephalopods. Others had evolved crushing teeth designed for processing hard-shelled prey like clams and ammonites. Some were fast, streamlined pursuit predators. Others may have been more ambush-oriented, lurking in the water until prey came within range. The largest mosasaurs were genuinely enormous. Mosasaurus itself could reach 15 or more meters in length, a body supported by powerful paddle-like flippers and driven through the water by an undulating tail. These were not slow animals. They were fast, responsive, and capable of the kind of explosive acceleration that makes large aquatic predators so effective. The fish of the seaway were spectacular in their own right. Zophanctinus was perhaps the most visually dramatic, a fish that could reach 6 meters in length, with a powerful torpedo-shaped body and protruding lower jaw of large spike-like teeth. Fossil specimens of Zophanctinus have been found with smaller fish preserved inside their abdominal cavities, the last meal preserved in stone. In at least one famous case, the fish inside appears to have been large enough to be lethal to the Zophanctinus itself. The prey, in its dying struggle, may have ruptured internal organs and killed the predator along with it. There is something darkly comedic about this, and also something instructive about the risks that predators take in every hunt. The ammonites of the seaway swam in their spiraling shells through the middle water, and their fossils are among the most commonly found in Cretaceous deposits across the American interior today. Walking a road cut through limestone in Kansas or Texas, you might see the cross-sections of ammonite shells in the rock face. The internal chambers visible, the elegant geometric precision of the scepter between them laid bare. 100 million years ago, those shells were alive, drifting through a warm sea that no longer exists. The western interior seaway also supported a diversity of marine reptiles that makes the mind reel slightly. Elasmosaurus, a plesiosaur with a neck so long that it comprised more than half of the animal's total body length, cruised the seaway in search of fish that it could snare with sudden, flexible movements of that extraordinary neck. Early descriptions of Elasmosaurus had the neck and tail confused. The discoverer initially placed the head at the tail end, which tells you something about how counterintuitive the proportions of this animal were. And sea turtles. The great sea turtles of the Cretaceous seaway included Archelon, which at 4 meters in length was the largest turtle that ever lived. Moving slowly through the warm water, feeding on soft prey, its massive shell providing some protection against the mosasaurs that shared its world. Turtle populations presumably suffered predation from the large marine reptiles around them, but the basic body plan, dome-shaped shell, withdrawable head and flippers, has proven one of the most successful defensive architectures in the history of vertebrate life. Turtles have been around since the Triassic and are with us still. The shallows of the seaway, particularly near the coasts, would have been rich with life in ways familiar from modern tropical marine environments. Beds of shellfish on the muddy bottom, schools of smaller fish moving in coordinated masses, their reflective scales flashing as they turned, echinoderms, sea urchins and sea stars and their relatives, working slowly across the seafloor, and in the water column, the constant invisible drama of plankton, the microscopic primary producers that form the base of everything. I want to pause here and acknowledge something about the western interior seaway that I find genuinely moving. The cities and farms and highways that today sit on the land it once occupied, Kansas City, Denver, Dallas, they exist because the sea is gone. The sea is gone because sea levels fell, and they fell because the world changed. The people who live in those cities today are utterly unconscious, as they go about their daily lives, that they are walking on the floor of an ancient ocean, that the rocks beneath their feet, beneath the soil, beneath the foundations of everything they have built, are Cretaceous limestone and chalk and shale. The compressed remains of millions of years of life in a sea that vanished before any human stood upright on the African savanna. Every landscape has this depth to it, this layered history. We walk on the surface of the present and have no idea, most of the time, what lies beneath. We have travelled across the northern lands, across North America and its great inland sea, touched on Europe and Asia. But there is another world that demands our attention tonight. The vast southern landmass of Gondwana, already in the process of its slow disintegration, but still a coherent geographical entity, still connected in important ways, still sharing its fauna across ancient land bridges and narrow straits. The Gondwanan world of 100 million years ago was different from the northern world in ways both subtle and obvious. The fauna was distinct in many respects. The sauropods here were the titanosaurs in their greatest diversity. The predators were the abelisaurids and carcharodontosaurids. The small animals were different in their specifics, though performing similar ecological roles. The plants too had their regional character. The ancient southern flora had its own evolutionary history, its own composition of conifers and cycads and ferns, and the first pioneering angiosperms. South America, at 100 million years ago, was an island continent, separated from North America by a seaway to the north. It would not reconnect with North America until the formation of the Isthmus of Panama, tens of millions of years in the future. In its isolation, the South American fauna was evolving on its own trajectory, producing animals found nowhere else on Earth. The enormous titanosaur sauropods that I described earlier, the abelisaurid predators, early representatives of lineages that would later explode in diversity when the continents reconnected. Africa was in a complex transitional state during this period. It had separated from South America, the South Atlantic was open and widening, but was still somewhat connected to Europe and Asia to the north via land masses and land bridges. The result was an African fauna with a complex biogeographic history, reflecting both the southern Gondwanan heritage and some influx from the northern world. The Kem Formation of Morocco and Algeria, which we visited earlier with Spinosaurus, gives us one of our best windows into African fauna at 100 million years ago. And the picture it presents is remarkable for its sheer concentration of apex predators. Alongside Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, the Kem also preserves evidence of enormous sauropods, the Titanosaur rebecosaurus, a large, long-necked plant-eater that formed part of the prey base for all these predators, and the giant crocodilians, Egisuchus and others, that occupied the river systems alongside everything else. The question of how so many large predators could coexist in the same ecosystem is one that paleontologists have grappled with seriously. The most likely explanation is ecological partitioning. The different predators occupied sufficiently different ecological niches that they were not in direct constant competition. Spinosaurus was semi-aquatic, hunting primarily in and near the water. Carcharodontosaurus was a terrestrial stalker. The large crocodilians occupied the riverbanks and waterways in their own way. By dividing up the available resources, different prey species, different habitats, different times of activity, they could coexist in the same landscape without constant destructive competition. This kind of ecological partitioning is something we see in ecosystems today. The Serengeti's lions, leopards, cheetahs, wild dogs and hyenas occupying overlapping ranges but hunting different prey, and in different ways. The Kem was, in a sense, an extreme version of this, a hyper-predator ecosystem, perhaps fueled by the extraordinary productivity of its river systems and the abundance of prey they supported. Further south in Gondwana, the land masses that would become Madagascar, India, Antarctica and Australia were still loosely connected or close enough to allow occasional faunal exchange. India was beginning its remarkable journey, adrift on its tectonic plate, moving northward at geologically unusual speed, eventually to collide with Asia in a collision that would define the geography of southern Asia. At 100 million years ago, India was an island, separated from Africa and moving through the Tethys Sea, a warm ancient ocean that existed in the space between the northern and southern supercontinents. The fauna of this isolated Indian subcontinent was, in some respects, deeply strange, reflecting its Gondwanan heritage but evolving in its own direction in the isolation of island existence. Some of the most unusual dinosaurs we know of come from the Cretaceous of India, forms that don't fit neatly into the categories established by the better-known faunas of other continents. And Antarctica. Let us spend a moment with Antarctica, because the Cretaceous version of this continent, the one that today is the coldest, driest, most inhospitable place on the surface of the Earth, was something entirely different. 100 million years ago, Antarctica was still attached to Australia, and together they occupied a position that was farther from the South Pole than Antarctica is today, but still in the high southern latitudes. Even so, the warm Cretaceous climate meant that even these high latitudes supported vegetation. The coastlines of Cretaceous Antarctica were probably temperate forests, not tropical, not even especially warm by tropical standards, but habitable. Real forests, with trees and undergrowth and the insects and birds and small vertebrates that depend on forested habitat. Fossils from Antarctica include dinosaurs, ornithopods and sauropods, and even some theropod material, suggesting that the continent was genuinely inhabited by a diverse fauna. These polar dinosaurs had to contend with the extreme seasonality of high latitudes, long summer days with nearly continuous light, dark winters with little or no sun. How they managed this is an interesting question. Some may have migrated, some may have used strategies similar to modern high-latitude animals, reducing activity in winter. Some may have benefited from the warm climate sufficiently that winters were mild enough to simply endure. The image of dinosaurs in a polar forest surrounded by trees adapted to extreme seasonality. The sun tracing a low arc across the sky before dipping below the horizon for weeks or months. It is one of the more unexpected images that Cretaceous paleontology has given us, and it is a reminder again that life is extraordinarily adaptable, extraordinarily persistent, extraordinarily creative in its solutions to the challenges that the physical world presents. We have ranged widely across the geography of the Cretaceous world. We have visited its seas and its forests, its floodplains and its river systems, its polar coasts and its desert rivers. But I want to pause now and do something different. I want to walk through a single day, a specific imagined day in the Middle Cretaceous world, perhaps on the edge of the Western Interior Seaway, where the forest meets the sea, and see what that day felt like from the inside. Dawn comes slowly in this world. The horizon is already pale when the first birds begin to call, and antiornithines. Their songs different from anything living today, but recognizable in their basic structure as the songs of birds. They call from the tree canopy, invisible in the pre-dawn dark, establishing territories and communicating in the way that birds have communicated since before the Cretaceous began. The air at dawn is cool relative to what the day will bring, not cold. The Cretaceous tropics and subtropics maintained comfortable temperatures even at night, but noticeably cooler than the afternoon heat, the moisture in the air condensing slightly on broad leaves, running down stems and dripping into the soil. The sounds of the night, the insects, the small mammals. The occasional distant call from a larger creature in the deeper forest are beginning to give way to the sounds of the day. And the day of the Cretaceous was slightly shorter than our own. Because of the gradual slowing of Earth's rotation over geological time, caused by the gravitational interaction between Earth and the Moon, which acts as a subtle but persistent brake on our spin, a day in the middle Cretaceous lasted approximately 23 hours rather than the 24 we know today. Over millions of years, those fractional differences in day length accumulate. The years were slightly longer, more days per year, each day slightly shorter. A Cretaceous year would have had perhaps 370 days, a small difference in the scale of individual experience, but a measurable one, preserved, amazingly, in the growth rings of fossil corals and the chemistry of ancient shells. By full sunrise, and the Cretaceous sun, though perhaps appearing slightly different through the CO2-rich atmosphere, was in all fundamental ways the same star we see today. The forest is fully alive. Insects fill every level of the canopy and undergrowth with their continuous overlapping sound. Smaller dinosaurs are already active, hunting insects and small vertebrates in the undergrowth. A herd of ornithopods has emerged from the tree cover onto a broad floodplain, spreading out across the open ground to graze, their heads moving rhythmically from the vegetation to the horizon as they maintain constant vigilance. On the floodplain, at the edge of a river, a large titanosaur has been feeding since before dawn, its metabolism requiring such a constant input of food that it barely rests. It moves slowly, its massive feet sinking into the soft riverbank mud, its neck sweeping in long arcs to strip leaves from trees and shrubs. The river nearby runs clear and warm, carrying a load of fine sediment from the young mountains to the west. The sound of moving water underlies everything. The middle hours of the day are the hottest. The Cretaceous sun, direct and intense in the low latitudes, heats the open ground to temperatures that smaller animals cannot long endure. The floodplain empties of the smaller and more temperature-sensitive species during the peak heat hours. They retreat to shade, to burrows, to the cooler air of the forest interior. The titanosaur, massive enough that its core temperature changes slowly, continues to feed, though perhaps its feeding rate slackens in the noon heat. In the water offshore, the great mosasaurs and plesiosaurs continue their patrol. They are unconcerned with surface temperature. The sea surface may be warm, but the deeper water is cooler, and large marine reptiles can thermoregulate to some degree through behavior, moving between warmer surface waters and cooler depths. The plesiosaurs in particular seem to have been capable of considerable diving depth, their long necks perhaps useful for reaching down into darker water where fish congregate. Late afternoon brings a change. The temperature begins to fall slightly. Not much, but enough. The insects resume their full intensity. The birds become active again. On the forest edge, a small family group of dromaeosaurids, feathered turkey-sized predators with the distinctive sickle claw on the second toe that defines their group, emerges to hunt. They move with the fluid, coordinated awareness of highly intelligent predators, tracking the movements of small ornithopods in the undergrowth with dark, alert eyes. The dromaeosaurids, made famous by the Jurassic Park franchise under the name Velociraptor, were, in most species, considerably smaller than their popular portrayal suggests. The actual Velociraptor from Mongolia was roughly turkey-sized. Some North American relatives, like Deinonychus, were larger but still much smaller than the movie versions. They were, however, feathered, and evidence suggests they may have been among the more behaviourally complex and potentially social of the non-avian dinosaurs. As the sun descends toward the horizon, tracing the same fundamental arc it traces today, though in a sky that looks slightly different through the thick Cretaceous atmosphere, the transition to night begins. The enantiornithines call again from their roosts. The mammals, which have spent the day sheltered and sleeping, begin to emerge from burrows and tree hollows, their large eyes widening in the fading light. And the night comes. In the Cretaceous night, the world does not go silent. The insects maintain their chorus. Different species now, the night singers rather than the day singers, but equally persistent. Small mammals rustling through leaf litter. The occasional sound of something larger moving in the darkness. The breathing of the great titanosaur still feeding slowly in the dark, its metabolism requiring input even now. Somewhere above, the Cretaceous sky glitters with stars. The same stars, essentially, as tonight's sky, arranged in the same constellations by the same cosmic geography, though the specific positions of the stars have shifted slightly over 100 million years due to the proper motion of individual stars through space. The Milky Way sweeps across the sky in the same broad band of light. The moon, smaller than today, farther away, its recession gradual across geological time, is present in the sky, and the tides it raises in the Cretaceous seas are slightly smaller than those it raises today. Under that ancient sky, the world breathes in and out. The tide rises and falls on Cretaceous shores. The rivers carry their loads of sediment. The plankton drift in the warm seas. The dinosaurs sleep, or don't sleep, in the case of the great grazers, and the night passes as it always passes, as it has always passed, as it will always pass. Slowly, gently. With a patience that only very old things possess, let us pay proper attention now to the plants, because without the plants, without the extraordinary, patient, sun-driven work of the photosynthesizers, there would have been nothing else. No herbivores to grow fat on their tissues, no predators to hunt the herbivores, no insects to pollinate their flowers, no birds to eat the insects, nothing but rock and water and bare mineral under an indifferent sky. The Cretaceous world was green in a way that is hard to fully express. Not greener than today's world in terms of total plant cover perhaps, but greener in its texture and character. The forests of the Cretaceous had a different composition, a different feel, a different sound in the wind. Conifers dominated much of the Cretaceous landscape, as they had dominated the land ever since the late Paleozoic. But the conifers of the Cretaceous were not exactly the conifers we know today. The Araucarian conifers, relatives of the modern monkey puzzle tree, were widespread and important. These ancient trees, with their distinctive umbrella-shaped canopies and stiff, scale-like leaves, created forests that looked quite unlike any modern forest. They could grow to enormous heights, some species perhaps exceeding 60 or 70 meters, creating a soaring, cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into deep green shadow below. Alongside the Araucarians, other conifers of various families occupied different niches in the forest mosaic. Some were adapted to wet, low-lying areas along riverbanks and floodplains. Others occupied drier, better-drained slopes and plateaus. The diversity of conifer species in the Cretaceous was extraordinary by modern standards. The modern world's conifer flora, impressive as it is a reduced remnant of the Mesozoic conifer diversity. And then there were the cycads. These ancient plants, which look something like a cross between a palm tree and a fern, had been important components of Mesozoic vegetation since the Triassic. By the Cretaceous, they remained significant in many ecosystems, particularly in warm, well-lit environments. They were not large plants. Most cycads are compact with a short trunk and a crown of stiff, feathery leaves, but they were persistent, patient survivors that had weathered every extinction and emerged still functioning. Cycads alive today are the living relatives of these Cretaceous plants, and when you look at a modern cycad in a botanical garden, you're looking at a plant type that a Cretaceous dinosaur would have recognized. The ginkgo trees were also present, in a diversity that has since been dramatically reduced. Today, only a single species of ginkgo survives, the familiar tree with its distinctive fan-shaped leaves that is planted widely in cities for its pollution tolerance. In the Cretaceous, there were many ginkgo species, occupying a variety of ecological roles. The ginkgo lineage is one of the oldest surviving plant lineages on Earth, stretching back to the Permian period, and the fact that even one species has survived to the present day, almost unchanged in its basic form for hundreds of millions of years, is a testament to the durability of a successful design. The ferns, of course, were everywhere. Ground cover, undergrowth, the vegetation of riverbanks and stream edges and disturbed areas, ferns filled every available low-light, high-moisture niche with their ancient, uncomplicated fronds. Some tree ferns, in suitable habitats, reached heights of several meters, their trunks rough with the compressed bases of old fronds, their new growth unfurling from tight spiral coils at the crown, the characteristic fiddlehead that is one of the most ancient growth patterns in the plant kingdom. And woven through all of this ancient flora, the newcomers, the flowering plants, still experimental, still in the early stages of their eventual dominance, but already present in significant diversity in some habitats, along disturbed riverbanks, in sunlit clearings, at the edges of forests. The angiosperms were establishing themselves. Their flowers, in this early period of diversification, range from simple, open structures accessible to many different insects, to increasingly specialized forms beginning to develop the complex partnerships with specific pollinators that would eventually produce the extraordinary diversity of modern flowering plant species. There were no grasses in the Cretaceous. This may sound like a small detail, but its consequences for the look and feel of the landscape were enormous. The open plains, the savannas, the prairies, the meadows, all the grassland ecosystems that today cover vast areas of every continent and support some of the most spectacular large animal communities on Earth, did not exist. Open areas existed, certainly, where the vegetation was low and sparse, but they were not grass-covered. They were covered by ferns and small flowering plants and bare ground, and other low-growing vegetation in combinations that have no perfect modern equivalent. The world without grasses feels somehow more ancient to me than any other aspect of the Cretaceous, more fundamentally different. Because grasses, and the animals that evolved to eat them, and the landscapes that evolved around their growth, are so central to our sense of what open country looks and feels like. A world without grasses is a world where the basic visual vocabulary of open landscape is simply absent. The titanosaurs grazing on Cretaceous floodplains were not grazing on grass. They were browsing on a different mosaic of vegetation entirely, and the adaptations of their teeth and digestive systems reflected this. They were living in a world that worked differently from any modern large herbivore ecosystem, and yet it worked. It was productive. It sustained enormous herbivore populations and the predators that depended on them. The specifics were different. The fundamental ecology was the same. Which is perhaps the deepest lesson that the fossil record keeps trying to teach us. That there is more than one way to be a forest, more than one way to be an ocean, more than one way to build a working ecosystem. The current arrangement of the living world, the particular species, the particular ecological relationships, the particular composition of the flora and fauna, is one solution to the problem of life on Earth. But the Cretaceous had other solutions, and they worked for tens of millions of years with a thoroughness and a richness that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. Among all the creatures of the Cretaceous world, there are some whose lineages have proven so durable, so fundamental to the way the world works, that they are still with us today. Not as fossils, not as reconstructions, as living animals going about their ancient business in the remnants of the world that the Cretaceous bequeathed to us. Let us spend time with the crocodilians. Because the crocodilians of the Cretaceous were not only present, they were extraordinarily diverse, far more diverse than the relatively constrained group of modern species might suggest. And in their diversity, they fill in a part of the Cretaceous ecological picture that is easy to overlook. Modern crocodilians, the crocodiles, alligators, caimans, and gharials that survive today, are all semi-aquatic ambush predators of tropical and subtropical wetlands. This is a successful ecological role. Clearly, the basic crocodilian body plan has remained largely unchanged for 150 million years, but it does not begin to capture the range of ecological roles that crocodilians and their close relatives occupied in the Cretaceous world. In the Cretaceous, there were terrestrial crocodilians, species adapted for life primarily on land, with upright mammal-like limbs rather than the sprawling posture of modern forms. These animals may have run rather than crawled, and some appear to have been herbivores, a radical departure from the strict carnivory of their modern relatives. There were armoured crocodilians with elaborate bony scales covering their bodies. There were small, agile forms and enormous, slow-moving behemoths. Sarcosuchus imperata, the flesh crocodile emperor, deserves special attention. This animal, known from excellent fossil material from the Kem Formation and other Cretaceous sites in Africa, was quite simply enormous. Estimates based on skull size and comparison with living relatives suggest a total length of 9 to 10 metres, possibly more, and a weight of 8 or 9 metric tons. This was not a river predator that would take fish and the occasional large animal that came to drink. This was an animal capable of taking large dinosaurs at the water's edge, and possibly in the water itself, with the same crushing ambush strategy that large modern Nile crocodiles use when large mammals come to drink. Even Spinosaurus, for all its size and specialization, would presumably have needed to exercise caution around the larger Sarcosuchus individuals. The Kem rivers were not safe environments for anyone, and yet crocodilians survived the end Cretaceous extinction that destroyed the non-avian dinosaurs. This is one of the more intriguing selective patterns of that great catastrophe. The same event that eliminated the titanosaurs, the tyrannosaurs, the mosasaurs, the pterosaurs and the ammonites left the crocodilians essentially intact. They lost many of their more specialized and diverse forms in the extinction, the terrestrial runners, the exotic ecomorphs, but the core of the lineage, the semi-aquatic ambush predators, survived? Why? The honest answer is that we're not entirely sure, and I think that honest uncertainty is important. Survival through a mass extinction is not a simple matter of being better or more adapted in any general sense. It is a matter of having, by chance or by design, the specific traits that happen to be useful given the specific nature of the catastrophe. The crocodilians may have survived in part because their semi-aquatic lifestyle placed them in river and lake systems where conditions, while dramatically altered, remained livable in the immediate aftermath of the impact. Their ability to go for long periods without food, a character of modern crocodilians, may have helped them ride out the period of reduced food availability. Their slow metabolism, requiring far less food than the warm-blooded dinosaurs, may have been a crucial advantage when food was scarce. Whatever the reasons, the crocodilians made it through. And they carry within them, in the architecture of their bodies and the logic of their behaviour, 100 million years of unbroken continuity with the world we have been visiting tonight. When you look at a large crocodile today, those ancient eyes, that patient stillness, the extraordinary economy of its waiting, you are looking at an animal that is, in its most fundamental aspects, a Cretaceous animal that has continued, essentially unchanged, into the present. There is something I find deeply moving in that, a living link, a window that opens, improbably, across 100 million years of time. The Cretaceous world was not only shaped by the living things that moved across its surface, it was shaped by forces from within the Earth itself, forces that operated on timescales even longer than the evolutionary processes we have been following. Volcanism was a constant presence in the Cretaceous world. The movement of tectonic plates, the same great engine that was separating the continents, opening new oceans, building new mountains, also drove volcanic activity at the boundaries between plates, and, in some cases, far from any plate boundary, in the mysterious volcanic hotspots that represent plumes of heat rising from deep within the mantle. During the Cretaceous period, there were several episodes of particularly intense volcanic activity, so intense that geologists classify them as large igneous provinces, or LIPs. These events, driven by the upwelling of enormous volumes of magma from the mantle, flooded vast areas of land or ocean floor with basalt, releasing enormous quantities of CO2 and other volcanic gases into the atmosphere. The consequences for climate and ocean chemistry were significant. Some LIP events have been associated with ocean anoxic events, periods when the deep ocean became depleted of oxygen, killing off many bottom-dwelling organisms and disrupting the entire ocean food web. One of the most important of these volcanic events for the Cretaceous world was the formation of what geologists call the Caribbean Large Igneous Province, an enormous outpouring of basalt that formed much of the floor of the early Caribbean Sea around 90 to 100 million years ago. The CO2 released by this event may have contributed to the warm pulse in Cretaceous climate at this time, and the resulting ocean anoxic event left its mark in the rock record as a distinctive layer of black, carbon-rich shale found across the world. Closer to the end of our story, but still within the Cretaceous, the Deccan Traps of what is now India were forming, an enormous sequence of basalt flows that built up over millions of years into a volcanic formation that still covers a vast area of the Indian subcontinent. The Deccan Traps were erupting in their early phases before the end Cretaceous extinction, and some researchers have suggested that their emissions contributed to the environmental stress that made the biosphere more vulnerable to the impact catastrophe that was to come. But volcanic activity was not only a large-scale climate-modifying force, it was also a local and regional presence in many parts of the Cretaceous world. Volcanic arcs, chains of volcanoes built above subducting oceanic plates, were active along the western margin of the Americas, along the edges of the Tethys Sea in Europe and Asia, in other tectonically active regions. Eruptions were part of the background noise of the Cretaceous world. Ash layers from volcanic eruptions are found throughout the Cretaceous rock record, preserved in sediments from around the world, marking moments when a distant volcano sent its plume across the sky and dusted the land and sea with fine mineral particles. For the animals living in the Cretaceous world, volcanic activity must have been a familiar, if irregular, feature of experience. The faint smell of sulphur in the air after a distant eruption, the haze that sometimes dimmed the sun after a large volcanic event, the ash layer on the ground that marked a spring morning after a night's fall of fine volcanic dust, and sometimes, more dramatically, the flow of lava across a landscape, the explosive eruption of a major volcano, the choking air around an active vent. Life in the Cretaceous was not without its hazards. The world was dynamic, geologically speaking, in ways that would be viscerally obvious to any observer. The volcanoes also gave. The rich, mineral-laden soils that form from weathered volcanic rock are among the most fertile on Earth, and Cretaceous volcanic regions were likely extraordinarily productive ecosystems, their soils dense with nutrients, their forests dense and tall and full of life. The same forces that could destroy also nourished. The cycle of destruction and renewal, thus central to the volcanic world, was part of the deeper rhythm of Cretaceous life, and under all of it, invisible but fundamental. The great engine of plate tectonics continued its patient work. The continents moved, the sea floors spread and subducted, mountains rose and mountains fell. The world was being built and rebuilt on timescales that no individual creature could perceive, but which shaped, in their slow accumulation, every aspect of the world that the creatures of the Cretaceous called home. Night has fallen over the Cretaceous world again. The enantiornithine birds have settled into their roosts. The larger dinosaurs have, perhaps, entered some form of sleep, though what sleep looked like for a sauropod or a ceratopsian is a question that the fossil record cannot easily answer. They probably rested, at least. The metabolic need for periods of reduced activity is deep and ancient in vertebrate physiology. But the night was not empty. The night was not wasted. The night belonged, most completely, to those creatures who had evolved to make darkness their element. The mammals, as we established, were primarily nocturnal. But let us think more carefully about what nocturnal life in the Cretaceous actually meant. What did a small Cretaceous mammal experience as it moved through the undergrowth in the small hours of an ancient night? First, the sounds. The Cretaceous night was sonically rich in ways that the fossil record can only dimly suggest. Insects, crickets and their ancestors, katydids and their early relatives, cicadas and their ancient cousins, called through the darkness in their persistent pulsing choruses. The sound of moving water, rivers, streams, the lapping of the inland sea against its shore, provided a constant background rhythm. Frogs, which had evolved by this time in the Cretaceous, added their voices to the soundscape of wetland edges. And the mammals themselves, do we have any sense of what sounds they made? Some probably used ultrasonic communication, as many small modern mammals do, calls pitched above the hearing range of most large predators, allowing communication without betraying location to the hearing-focused predators that would have found them a convenient meal. The large, complex ears of Cretaceous mammals, one of the defining anatomical features of the lineage, with the middle ear bones that we carry in our own heads having been repurposed from jaw bones in the early mammalian lineage, were probably tuned to a wide frequency range, excellent for detecting both the calls of conspecifics and the approaching footsteps of predators. In the darkness, smell was as important as hearing. The Cretaceous night air would have been laden with scent. The rotting vegetation of the forest floor, the musky territorial markings of various animals, the chemical signatures of prey and predator alike. Small mammals navigating the night primarily through smell and hearing, using their whiskers to sense vibrations and obstacles in the dark. Their warm bodies maintaining the elevated temperatures that kept their nervous systems operating at peak efficiency even in the cool of the night. Some larger dinosaurs were also active at night, particularly predators in cooler climates where nighttime temperatures fell enough that warm-blooded animals had a significant advantage over the cold-dependent reptiles. Troodon, a relatively small, large-eyed theropod, has been proposed as a nocturnal or crepuscular predator, its very large eyes suggesting adaptation for low-light conditions. If correct, this represents a fascinating ecological overlap with the mammals, competing potentially in the same nocturnal niche for some of the same prey. The insects of the Cretaceous night were a world in themselves. Beetles, already one of the most species-rich groups of animals, were active in the darkness, some feeding on vegetation, some on fungi, some on dead wood. Some as predators of other insects. Moths, already present in their ancient early forms, flew toward whatever light sources existed in the pre-human world. The moon, occasionally the dim glow of bioluminescent fungi on rotting wood, the faint light of stars. In a world without artificial light, the moth's attraction to natural light sources would have been a consistent behavior, not the fatal confusion we see today when they spiral endlessly toward electric bulbs. The fireflies, or their ancient ancestors at least, were probably present in the Cretaceous, producing their cold light through the same basic biochemical mechanism that fireflies use today. Imagine the Cretaceous night edged with the intermittent flashing of bioluminescent insects, their signals tracing erratic paths through the warm air above the forest floor. It is, I think, one of the more beautiful details that our reconstruction of this ancient world can offer, that the darkness of the Cretaceous night was not unrelieved darkness. It was punctuated by small lights, biological and ephemeral, as alive as everything else in this extraordinary world. And in the rivers and pools of the Cretaceous night, bioluminescent organisms, bacteria, protists, perhaps some invertebrates, may have tinged the water with light when disturbed. The bow wave of a large animal moving through a pool at night, the trail of a fish turning in shallow water, lit from within by the ancient chemistry of light. We have travelled far tonight. We have moved through 100 million years of distance to walk, in imagination, through a world that no human eye has ever seen. We have visited the warm seas and the dense forests, met the giants and the small ones, understood something of the climate and the geography and the daily rhythms of this ancient earth. And now I want to step back, even further back than we have already gone. I want to try to hold the Cretaceous in perspective, to understand not just what it was, but where it fits in the larger story of life on this planet. Life on Earth began somewhere around 3.8 billion years ago, a date that is itself approximate, lost in the deepest antiquity of the geological record. For most of that time, for the first 3 billion years or so, life was microscopic. Bacteria and archaea, transforming the chemistry of the planet, slowly building the oxygen-rich atmosphere that would eventually allow larger, more complex life to emerge. There were no animals, no plants, no fungi, just the patient, invisible work of single-celled organisms, changing the world on a timescale so vast that it makes the entire history of complex life seem like a brief afterthought. Complex, multicellular animals, what we would recognize as animals, appeared somewhere around 600 million years ago. The first vertebrates, creatures with backbones, appeared around 500 million years ago. Fish ruled the oceans for tens of millions of years before any vertebrate dared to emerge onto land. The first tetrapods, the four-limbed vertebrates, ancestors of all amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals, made that transition to land around 375 million years ago. The dinosaurs appeared around 230 million years ago, in the aftermath of the Triassic extinction. They dominated the land for 165 million years. 165 million years. If you were to compress the entire history of life on Earth into a single year, the dinosaurs' reign would occupy roughly 2 weeks. 2 weeks of dominance, and then the asteroid. The entire history of our own species, Homo sapiens, fits into the last few hours of December 31st of that same year. We have been here for a geological instant. We have built our cities and written our histories and gone to the moon in the blink of a geological eye. The Cretaceous period, the entire Cretaceous from its beginning to its catastrophic end, lasted about 79 million years. It is, from our perspective, an almost incomprehensible span of time, and yet it is just one episode in the long story of life on Earth. It had its beginning and its ending. It had its characteristic cast of characters and its particular ecological arrangements, and it is gone. Completely, irrevocably gone. In the sense that the specific species and communities and ecosystems it contained no longer exist. And yet the Earth continues. The sun rises and sets. The tides move in and out. The weather changes. Life goes on. Different in its specifics, continuous in its essence. I find something deeply calming in this perspective. Not nihilistic. Not the cold comfort of everything being meaningless. More like the warmth of understanding that existence is old and resilient and creative in ways that exceed our capacity to fully appreciate. The world has survived the end of the Cretaceous, as it survived the end of the Permian and the end of the Devonian and every other mass extinction in the geological record. Life finds its way, not the same life, never exactly the same, but life in its capacity for variety and adaptation and sheer persistence, has always found a way forward. We are here because of the Cretaceous, because the dinosaurs cleared the ecological landscape in ways that allowed the mammals to diversify, because the flowering plants evolved their partnerships with insects that eventually produced the vast agricultural base of human civilization, because the chalk and limestone deposited on the Cretaceous seafloor formed the building materials for human cities, because the oil and gas that powered the Industrial Revolution were largely formed from the organic matter of Cretaceous marine plankton. We are, in a very real sense, made of the Cretaceous. It is in our bones and our crops and our buildings and our machines. The world that ended 66 million years ago continues, transformed almost beyond recognition, but continuous in its chemistry and its energy and its living descendants. into the present, into this present night, into this moment, into you. There is a body of water that no longer exists, not in any form that we would recognize, and yet it was, for hundreds of millions of years, one of the defining features of the planet, the Tethys Sea, an ancient ocean that lay between the northern and southern supercontinents, connecting the warm waters of the tropics in a broad, shallow expanse that at its greatest extent wrapped nearly halfway around the globe. By 100 million years ago, the Tethys was already in the later stages of its long existence. The closing of the gap between Gondwana and Laurasia, driven by the northward drift of the various Gondwanan fragments, was slowly consuming the Tethys from the west. But in the east, in what is now the region of Turkey, the Caucasus, Iran and northern India, the Tethys was still an impressive body of water, a warm, shallow tropical sea with all the ecological richness that such an environment implies. The sedimentary record of the Tethys is one of the most studied in all of geology. The limestones, chalks, and marls that were deposited on its floor now form the rocks of the Alps, the Himalayas, the Zagros Mountains, the Anatolian Plateau, great mountain ranges built from the debris of collision, but retaining within them the fossils of the Tethys's ancient inhabitants. When mountaineers on Everest find marine fossils near the summit, they are finding the remains of the Tethys Sea, lifted to the top of the world by the collision of India with Asia. The Tethys in the Cretaceous was warm and generally shallow along its margins, deepening toward its centre. Its circulation was influenced by the geography of the surrounding land, the irregular coastlines of Gondwana to the south, and the various components of Laurasia to the north, creating bays and inlets, and shallow platforms with their own distinct ecological characters. Coral reefs fringed some of its shores. The rich, chalky carbonate sediments that were being deposited across the shallow ocean floor bespoke the extraordinary productivity of its surface waters. The marine life of the Tethys overlapped substantially with what we would find in the other warm seas of the Cretaceous world. Ammonites and plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and the vast communities of microscopic plankton that drove the great carbonate factory of the Cretaceous ocean. But the Tethys also had its own character, its own regional distinctiveness, shaped by its particular geography and circulation patterns. And as the Tethys gradually closed, as Gondwana fragments collided with the Eurasian landmass one by one, the marine populations trapped in its shrinking waters faced increasing isolation and environmental stress. Some species found refuge in the expanding Atlantic to the west. Others simply went extinct as their habitat disappeared. The closure of the Tethys was one of the great ongoing biogeographical events of the Cretaceous world. Slow, invisible on any human timescale, but transformative over millions of years. There is a melancholy to the story of the Tethys. This ancient sea, so productive, so biologically rich, so central to the ecology of the Mesozoic world, simply ceased to exist. It was replaced by collision zones and mountain ranges and landlocked remnants, the Protethys of Central Asia, the ancestral Mediterranean. The ocean closed, the mountain ranges rose from its floor, and the fossils of its ancient inhabitants, the ammonites and the rudists and the Cretaceous corals, were lifted, by the relentless mechanism of plate tectonics, to altitudes where life cannot breathe. The mountains remember what was once the sea floor. The rock is patient that way. Let us talk about feathers, not as a side note, not as a passing curiosity, but as the central subject they deserve to be. Because feathers are one of the most significant innovations in the entire history of vertebrate life, and their story is deeply, intimately connected to the world of the Cretaceous. Feathers evolved in the theropod dinosaur lineage, and the earliest forms we know about were not flight feathers. They were simple, filamentous structures, more like very complex hair than like the aerodynamically sophisticated flight feathers of modern birds. These proto-feathers appear to have evolved first for insulation. Warm-blooded animals, and the evidence increasingly suggests that many theropods were warm-blooded, or at least capable of elevated metabolic rates, need insulation to maintain their elevated body temperatures in a world where the air outside is cooler than the body temperature they are trying to maintain. The earliest feathered dinosaurs we know from the fossil record, found primarily in the extraordinary Yixian and Jiufatang formations of northeastern China, show a range of feathering conditions. Some had simple hair-like down covering much of their bodies. Others had more structured feathers with a central quill and branching barbs. Some had long, elaborate display feathers on their arms or tails that clearly served a communicative rather than an insulating function. By the time we reach 100 million years ago, feathers in the theropod lineage had diversified enormously. The birds, the avian dinosaurs, had already arrived at the fully developed flight feather, with its elaborate system of interlocking barbules that creates the smooth, aerodynamic surface we associate with bird wings today. But even among the non-avian theropods, feathers of various kinds were present in many species across a wide size range. Feathers for insulation, feathers for display, feathers for communication, signalling species identity, individual quality, readiness to mate or willingness to fight. And for some lineages, feathers for flight. The transition from simple insulating proto-feathers to the complex flight apparatus of birds represents one of the most well-documented major evolutionary transitions in the fossil record, a transition preserved in exquisite detail in the Chinese fossils that have transformed our understanding of dinosaur evolution over the past 30 years. And here is a thought that I find genuinely arresting. The feathers of birds alive today, the feather on a crow's wing, the tail feather of a peacock, the down on a duckling, are the direct evolutionary descendants of the feathers that covered the bodies of Cretaceous dinosaurs, not descended in some vague analogical sense, directly descended through an unbroken genealogical chain from structures that were present 100 million years ago on animals that walk the Cretaceous Earth. Every time you see a bird, you're seeing an echo of the Cretaceous, a living, flying, calling, nesting, singing echo. The discovery of feathered dinosaurs was one of the great revolutions in scientific understanding of the 20th century. For most of the history of paleontology, dinosaurs were imagined as large, scaly, essentially reptilian creatures, more like very big lizards or crocodiles than like anything warm-blooded and feathered. That image has been essentially demolished by the fossil record of the past 3 decades. We now know that feathers were widespread in the theropod lineage. We know that at least some dinosaurs incubated their eggs with their bodies, in bird-like fashion. We know that complex social behaviour, including what appear to be communal nesting grounds, existed in some dinosaur groups. The dinosaurs were not the cold, slow, stupid creatures of old imagination. They were dynamic, diverse, probably warm or warmish-blooded, feathered in many lineages, behaviourally complex and extraordinarily successful. They were in many ways more like birds than like reptiles, which makes sense since the birds are their direct descendants. This revision in our understanding of the dinosaurs is, I think, one of the most important intellectual achievements of modern paleontology. It requires us to completely rethink what we mean when we say quote 5. It requires us to understand that the distinction between quote 6 and quote 7 that seems so obvious to us, one is extinct, one is not. One is scaly, one is feathered, one walked, one flew, is, from an evolutionary perspective, almost entirely arbitrary. Birds are dinosaurs that happen to be in the right place at the right time. The rest are birds that happen to be in the wrong place. The oceans of the Cretaceous were not only biologically different from today's oceans, they were chemically different. And those chemical differences had profound consequences for the kind of life that could exist within them, the way that life functioned, and the geological record that those oceans left behind. Consider calcium carbonate, the mineral from which shells and coral skeletons and the coccoliths of the microscopic algae are built. The Cretaceous oceans were, by the best available evidence, in a state called calcite seas, a state where the chemistry of the seawater favoured the precipitation of calcite rather than aragonite, as the dominant form of calcium carbonate. This distinction matters because different groups of marine organisms build their shells from different carbonate minerals, and the dominant mineral in the seawater affects which organisms find it easier to build their shells and which find it more difficult. The high CO2 of the Cretaceous atmosphere dissolved into the ocean surface waters, making them slightly more acidic than they would otherwise be. But the Cretaceous ocean chemistry was buffered by other factors, including the high rates of weathering and carbonate input from rivers, such that the ocean was not acidifying in the way that today's oceans are acidifying in response to our increased atmospheric CO2. The chemistry was different, but it was an equilibrium chemistry, stable over millions of years in a way that our current ocean acidification trend is not. The oxygen content of the Cretaceous deep ocean is another fascinating area of active research. Several times during the Cretaceous, geologists find evidence for what are called ocean anoxic events, periods when the deep ocean became depleted of oxygen, creating vast dead zones in the deep water where only anaerobic bacteria could survive. These events, which appear in the ocean, and the extraordinary abundance of coccolithophores in the Cretaceous ocean created conditions for chalk deposition that have not been matched before or since in the geological record. The chalk formations of the Cretaceous, from the White Cliffs of Britain to the vast chalk prairies of the American interior, represent the most extensive carbonate deposition in Earth's history. All of that calcium carbonate came from living organisms. Every atom of it was once part of a living cell, was synthesized by a coccolithophore cell using the energy of sunlight and the raw materials of the seawater. The White Cliffs of Dover are not a geological formation in the abstract sense. They are a biological formation, the accumulated physical remains of trillions upon trillions of microscopic lives. I find this thought one of the most quietly profound in all of natural history. That life, in its abundance and its chemical industriousness, can literally build the landscape, can transform the floor of an ocean into the building blocks of mountains and cliffs, can leave its mark on the planet so indelibly that 100 million years later we can stand at the edge of those cliffs and understand, if we know how to look, the living world that built them. We have talked a great deal about the bodies of Cretaceous animals, their shapes and sizes and ecological roles. But what about their inner lives? What about their behaviour, their social complexity, their cognitive capabilities? This is one of the most challenging and most fascinating areas of modern paleontology, because behaviour doesn't fossilise in the way bones do. We cannot directly observe how a Cretaceous dinosaur behaved. We can only infer, but inference from the available evidence can take us further than you might think. Consider the evidence for social behaviour in dinosaurs. Trackways, the preserved footprints of animals moving across ancient mud or sand, sometimes preserve groups of individuals moving together, their tracks parallel, their stride lengths suggesting similar pacing. Mass death assemblages, where many individuals of the same species are found in the same deposit, suggest that some dinosaurs were living and dying together, possibly in herds, though interpreting the cause of mass mortality is complex. Nesting grounds with multiple nests of the same species clustered together, as found for Maiasaura in Montana, suggest communal nesting behaviours. The structure of some dinosaur brains, inferred from endocasts of the brain cases, provides information about the relative development of different brain regions. The olfactory regions, the optic lobes, the cerebellum, all of these can be assessed in broad terms from the shape of the brain case, and comparisons with modern animals allow cautious inferences about sensory capabilities and behavioural complexity. The small, bird-like theropods, the troodontids, the dromaeosaurids, and their relatives, had encephalization quotients, a measure of brain size relative to body size, comparable to modern birds. This is significant because modern birds are not unintelligent animals. Crows, parrots, and other corvids and cystacines demonstrate complex problem-solving, tool use, and social intelligence that rivals that of many mammals. If the small feathered theropods had similar brain organization and relative brain size, they were probably capable of complex behaviors that we have barely begun to infer from the fossil record. There is, for instance, the question of play. Play behavior, the apparently purposeless, energy-expending activity that young animals in many species engage in, is associated with complex nervous systems, and is thought to be a form of behavioral practice and neural development. Do dinosaurs play? We cannot know for certain, but given what we know about the brain complexity of some small theropods, and given the broad evolutionary conservatism of developmental behaviors in the vertebrate lineage, it seems at least plausible that young, social theropods engaged in play behavior. I like to think about a group of juvenile dromaeosaurids in the undergrowth of a Cretaceous forest, wrestling and chasing each other with the exuberant, slightly clumsy energy of young animals learning their bodies. It's an image we can't confirm, but it is an image consistent with what we know about the biology of smart, social, feathered vertebrates. The large herbivores present their own behavioural puzzles. The sauropods, with their tiny heads relative to their enormous bodies, have traditionally been imagined as somewhat simple creatures, large, slow-brained, doing little more than eating and moving. But this image may be unfair. Recent work on sauropod trackways suggests that some species moved in coordinated groups, with smaller individuals, perhaps juveniles, positioned in the center of the group, surrounded by larger adults. This is a protective formation, familiar from the behavior of modern elephants and other large social herbivores, and it implies a level of social organization that goes beyond mere coincidental aggregation. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs with their elaborate frills, present perhaps the most compelling case for complex social behavior among the large dinosaurs. The frills and horns of ceratopsians were almost certainly used at least in part for visual display, for species recognition, for mate attraction, for rival intimidation. The extraordinary diversity of frill shape and horn configuration among different ceratopsian species suggests that these structures evolved under strong selective pressure from conspecific competition, the same kind of pressure that produces the elaborate antlers of deer and the colourful plumage of birds. And display implies an audience. An animal that invests heavily in visual signals is an animal that has conspecifics capable of reading and responding to those signals. This is social behaviour, even if it's competitive or adversarial rather than cooperative. The ceratopsians were communicating. They were in some sense talking to each other, in the visual language of biology rather than sound, but talking nonetheless. The inner lives of Cretaceous animals are ultimately inaccessible to us. We cannot know what it felt like to be a titanosaur, or a small mammal in the Cretaceous undergrowth, or a plesiosaur hunting in the warm waters of the interior seaway. But we can know that those inner lives existed, that there was something it was like to be those animals, even if we cannot access that experience directly. The nervous systems were there, the senses were there, the moment-to-moment experience of existence, however different from our own, was there. The Cretaceous world was not a background, it was a foreground, it was experienced. We have talked about what the Cretaceous world looked like, the vegetation, the animals, the light and water, and through forest. But what did it sound like? What would you hear if you could stand in the middle of a Cretaceous ecosystem and simply listen? This is a question that paleontology can address, at least partially, through a combination of fossil evidence for sound-producing structures, comparative anatomy with modern relatives, and what we know about the physical environment. The most obvious answer is insects. The Cretaceous soundscape was, in all probability, dominated by insect sound in much the way that modern tropical soundscapes are dominated by insect sound. Crickets and their ancestors, katydids, cicadas and their ancient relatives, all the singing insects of the modern world trace their sound-producing mechanisms back to lineages that were established well before the Cretaceous. The night air would have been filled with their pulsing, overlapping choruses in ways that any modern visitor to a tropical region would recognize immediately. The birds added their voices to the Cretaceous soundscape as we have established. The Enantiornithines and other early bird groups were capable of vocalizations. Their vocal anatomy was not as elaborate as that of modern songbirds, but birds were calling. What those calls sounded like we cannot know directly, but the basic physics of bird sound production suggests a range of frequencies and patterns not entirely unlike what we hear from modern birds. But what about the dinosaurs themselves? This is a fascinating question that has received serious scientific attention. The vocalizations of non-avian dinosaurs are not directly preserved in the fossil record. Soft tissue structures decay, leaving no trace in stone. But we can make inferences from anatomy and from comparison with modern relatives. Crocodilians vocalize. They produce bellowing sounds, hisses, and various low-frequency calls used in social interactions and territorial behavior. Some of these sounds are produced by exhaled air vibrating soft tissue structures, and some involve the resonance chambers of the skull and nasal passages. If the large non-avian dinosaurs had similar or homologous vocal structures, they may have been capable of similar sounds. Low-frequency bellows and calls that carried well over long distances are suitable for the kinds of long-range communication that large animals in open or forested landscapes would need. Some researchers have proposed that at least some dinosaurs produced closed-mouth vocalizations, sounds made by forcing air through structures within the body rather than through an open mouth, similar to the pigeon coo or the various booming sounds made by birds like the bittern. This mechanism can produce very low-frequency sounds that travel remarkably well through dense vegetation, and it leaves less anatomical trace than open-mouth vocalization, making it compatible with what we observe in the fossil record. The hadrosaurs, the duck-billed dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous, present a particularly interesting case. Many hadrosaur species had elaborate hollow crests on their skulls, and the internal structure of these crests forms complex passages that researchers have modelled as resonating chambers. Based on the geometry of these chambers, acoustic models have been built that predict what sounds a hadrosaur might have produced by passing air through its crest. The results are extraordinary: low, haunting resonances, somewhat horn-like, quite unlike any modern animal sound. A hadrosaur chorus, if it existed, would have been the most alien-sounding component of the Cretaceous soundscape. The rivers and seas added their constant background. The sound of moving water, always present in landscapes with rain and rivers, a sound that reaches back before any animals were alive to hear it. The wind in the conifers made a different sound from the wind in modern deciduous forests. The stiff, scale-like leaves of the araucarians and the long needles of various conifers producing their own frequency signatures. The sound of rain on large leaves in the tropical regions, that dense, enveloping percussion of a tropical downpour, this too was present, unchanged from then to now. And perhaps the pterosaurs added their voices. The large pterosaurs, with their crests and their size, may have been capable of vocalizations. A large azhdarchid, soaring above a Cretaceous landscape, calling, in whatever mode and frequency the anatomy of its throat and resonating structures would allow, is an image that I cannot verify but find irresistible in its strangeness. The Cretaceous world was not silent. It was loud, layered, complex, a soundscape built of millions of individual voices, none of them aware of the whole, all of them contributing to the texture of a world that no human has ever heard. And yet the sound waves they generated, every one of them, are still travelling, still moving outward at the speed of sound into the universe. By now they are long gone from the solar system, racing through the vast emptiness between the stars. The voice of a Cretaceous cricket transformed by 100 million years of travel into an undetectable whisper far, far from the world that made it. Everything that has ever made a sound is still, in some infinitely diluted way, still making it. The universe remembers. We have spent so much time looking at the world at eye level and above, the great animals, the forests, the skies. But there is another world in the Cretaceous that is literally beneath the feet of everything we have been describing, the world of the soil, the underground. Soil is not simply ground. Soil is a living system, perhaps the most complex living system per unit volume that exists on Earth. A single teaspoon of healthy modern soil contains more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. Bacteria, fungi, archaea, nematodes, mites, springtails, beetle larvae, earthworm relatives, and countless other organisms living in an intricate web of chemical and physical interactions, breaking down dead organic matter, cycling nutrients, building the mineral structure that allows plants to grow. The soils of the Cretaceous were almost certainly as biologically rich as those of today, though their specific composition was different. Modern earthworms, so central to modern soil formation, were not present in the Cretaceous in the groups we know today, though ancient oligocate worms were present. The specific fungi and bacteria that dominate modern soil communities were different in their specifics, though the fundamental functions they performed, decomposition, nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, were being carried out by their Cretaceous equivalents. The mycorrhizal fungi, the networks of fungal threads that form symbiotic associations with the roots of plants, extending the root system's reach in exchange for sugars, were established in the Cretaceous, as they had been since long before it. The partnership between plants and their root fungi is one of the most ancient and most ecologically important symbioses in the history of life. Without it, most plants cannot grow effectively in natural soils. With it, they can extract nutrients from a volume of soil far greater than their root system alone could reach. The underground world of the Cretaceous was also inhabited by larger animals. The small mammals, as we have noted, were primarily ground dwellers and tree dwellers, many of them using burrows for shelter. The burrows they excavated were part of the underground ecosystem, providing habitat for other small organisms, changing the structure of the soil, affecting water infiltration and nutrient distribution. Some dinosaurs may also have been burrowers. Oryctodromeus, a small ornithopod from North America known from fossils that include an adult and juveniles preserved inside what appears to have been a burrow structure, provides direct evidence that at least some dinosaurs dug into the soil for shelter. This is a remarkable finding because it means that the underground world of the Cretaceous was inhabited not only by small warm-blooded mammals, but also by their large-bodied, cold-bodied counterparts. The insects, of course, were paramount in the underground. Beetle larvae, the grubs of thousands of species, fed on the roots of plants, on dead wood below the soil surface, on each other. Ant colonies, in their primitive Cretaceous forms, were beginning to engineer the soil in the ways that modern ant colonies do, excavating chambers and galleries, building complex structures, moving vast quantities of soil in their collective operations. Termites too were present by the Cretaceous, their wood-digesting capabilities already making them important decomposers of dead plant material both above and below the ground. The soil is where the cycle of life and death ultimately plays out. Every organism that lives on the Cretaceous surface, every titanosaur, every bird, every tree, every insect, eventually dies and returns to the soil. And in the soil, the patient biochemistry of decomposition breaks it all back down. The proteins into amino acids, the carbohydrates into simple sugars, the minerals into available ions. The substance of the dead becomes the substance of the living in an endless cycle that has been running without interruption for billions of years. The soil remembers everything that has ever lived in it, in the chemical language of nutrients and organic matter and trace elements. The Cretaceous soil is long gone. Broken down and recycled and transformed over 100 million years, but the elements that composed it are still present in the world, still cycling, still moving through organisms and ecosystems and the great chemical cycles that connect the living to the non-living. Nothing is truly lost from the planetary system. Everything is just somewhere else, in a different form, waiting to be part of something new. On a clear Cretaceous night, far from the modest warming glow of any volcanic activity, the sky would have been extraordinary. Without artificial light, without cities, without electricity, without any of the radiant pollution that now obscures the night sky for a majority of the human population, the Cretaceous night sky would have blazed with stars. The full glory of the Milky Way, visible as a broad band of light across the sky, a density of stars so thick that their combined light gives the galaxy's disk a visible, structured luminosity. The particular bright stars that define the ancient constellations were, by 100 million years ago, mostly in positions somewhat different from where they appear today. Their proper motions through space accumulated over 100 million years, having shifted them from their Cretaceous positions. But the overall pattern of the sky, the broad sweep of the galaxy, the brightness hierarchy of the individual stars, would have been broadly recognizable. The moon was there, somewhat smaller and brighter than we see it today. Because the moon has been gradually moving away from the Earth over geological time, the tidal interaction that has slowed the Earth's rotation has also transferred angular momentum to the moon's orbit, pushing it slowly outward. The Cretaceous moon was perhaps somewhat closer to Earth than today. The difference in apparent size would have been small. The Cretaceous moon would still have appeared as the dominant night sky object, its phases marking the rhythms of the month, its gravity raising tides in the Cretaceous seas. The planets of our solar system were present in the Cretaceous sky, moving against the background of stars in their slow, stately dances, visible as points of light that didn't twinkle the way stars do. Their disk-like appearance, even to the naked eye, distinguishing them from the point source stars. Venus and Jupiter, the brightest planets, would have been as striking in the Cretaceous sky as they are in ours. Did anything in the Cretaceous world respond to the night sky? Did any Cretaceous organism navigate by the stars? Almost certainly not. Celestial navigation appears to be a relatively recent evolutionary development, and the specific brain structures associated with it in modern birds and other animals were probably not present in their full form in the Cretaceous. But the moon's light, the soft silvery illumination of a full Cretaceous moon, would have been ecologically significant. Nocturnal predators would have been more effective under the moon's light. Nocturnal prey would have been more exposed. The rhythm of the lunar cycle, influencing both the tides and the availability of light, was woven into the behavioral cycles of the living world even in the absence of any conscious awareness of the moon itself. I find myself thinking, at this point in our journey, about the nature of witness. The Cretaceous sky was extraordinarily beautiful, genuinely, objectively, in every physical sense, and yet there was no one there to call it beautiful. There were eyes to receive the light. There were nervous systems to process the visual information. But there was no conceptual framework within which to classify the experience as beauty, no language to describe it, no desire to share the observation with others. The beauty was unwitnessed, and in being unwitnessed, it existed in a pure form that we can approach but never quite achieve, because for us, the act of perceiving beauty is inseparable from the act of conceptualizing it, naming it, wanting to tell someone about it. There is something profoundly humbling about this, about the realization that the world has been beautiful for billions of years without needing anyone to notice. The stars blazed over the Cretaceous night. The dawn light caught the dew on ancient fern fronds. The sunset turned the warm sea the colour of copper and bronze, and none of it needed us to be beautiful. It just was. It still is. It will continue to be, with or without witnesses, as long as there is light and the world to receive it. And somehow, that thought, that the beauty of the world is older and deeper and more independent than our appreciation of it, is one of the most comforting thoughts I know. It means the world is not dependent on us for its worth. It means that beauty is a fact about the universe, not just a construction of our minds. It means that on the nights when we're too tired or too overwhelmed or too distracted to notice the stars do not mind. They just go on being what they are, as they always have, as they are right now above you, wherever you are in the world tonight. We have met the giants and the hunters of the Cretaceous world, but the dinosaurs were far more diverse than the popular imagination generally suggests, and tonight I want to take a longer, more leisurely walk through that diversity, through the full spectrum of dinosaurian life, from the enormous to the tiny, from the plains of Gondwana to the forests of Laurasia, from the lumbering herbivores to the swift and feathered hunters. The ceratopsians, the horned dinosaurs, represent one of the great dinosaurian success stories of the Cretaceous, particularly in the northern landmasses of Laurasia. Beginning as small, bipedal animals with relatively modest frills and horns, they evolved over tens of millions of years into some of the most elaborately decorated creatures in the history of vertebrate life. By the end of the Cretaceous, the large ceratopsians like Triceratops would reach lengths of 9 meters and weights of several tons, bearing a frill and horn arrangement of extraordinary visual impact. But at 100 million years ago, the ceratopsians were still in their earlier, more diverse experimental phase. Multiple lineages were exploring the possibilities of frill and horn ornamentation, each arriving at different solutions. Some had tall, pointed frills with elaborate bony projections at the frill's edge. Some had forward-pointing horns above the nose. Some had horns above the eyes. Some had both. The variety of solutions to the apparent selective pressure for impressive visual display was remarkable, a vivid illustration of the evolutionary process exploring the possibility space of a basic design. The ankylosaurs, the armored dinosaurs, were another successful Cretaceous lineage, present on both Laurasia and Gondwana. These low-slung, heavily built herbivores carried elaborate bony armour embedded in their skin, rows of osteoderms or bony skin plates, arranged in patterns that varied among species, some smooth, some keeled, some with elaborate spikes. Some ankylosaurs carried a massive bony club at the tip of the tail, a defensive weapon that paleontological analysis suggests was capable of breaking bone if swung with sufficient force. What did it feel like to be an ankylosaur? To carry that extraordinary burden of armour through the world, that permanent weight of protection that must have slowed movement, restricted certain postures, made life a slower and more deliberate affair than it was for the unarmoured herbivores. And yet the investment in armour was clearly worth it. The ankylosaurs were successful for tens of millions of years, surviving and diversifying through the full span of the Cretaceous. The armour worked. The predators that shared their world could not easily breach it. The pachycephalosaurs, the dome-headed dinosaurs, present one of the more puzzling behavioural mysteries of the Cretaceous. These bipedal herbivores had skulls thickened into dense bony domes of varying elaborateness, sometimes adorned with additional bony knobs and projections around the edge of the dome. The traditional interpretation was that these animals used their domes in headbutting contests, similar to the behaviour of modern bighorn sheep or musk oxen. More recent biomechanical analyses have questioned this interpretation, suggesting that the architecture of the skull was not necessarily optimized for absorbing the impact of a direct head-on collision. Perhaps the dome was used for flank butting, slamming the dome against the flank or side of a competitor rather than head-on. Perhaps it was primarily for visual display. The honest answer is that we still don't fully know. The debate over pachycephalus or head-butting illustrates something important about the practice of paleontology. Even the most apparently straightforward behavioral hypothesis, these animals had thick domes, therefore they head-butted, turns out under careful analysis to be more complicated than it appears. The fossil record gives us the hardware. Understanding what behaviours that hardware enabled requires inference and analysis, and ultimately a degree of humility about the limits of what we can know. The ornithomimosaurs on the ___9__, were among the fastest of the Cretaceous dinosaurs. Lightly built, long-legged with small heads and large eyes, they bore a strong superficial resemblance to modern ostriches, and were probably capable of similar running speeds, perhaps 60 or 70 kilometers per hour in short bursts. Their diet remains debated. Early reconstructions imagined them as active predators, but the lack of teeth and the structure of their hands suggests that they may have been omnivores, or even predominantly herbivores, using their speed primarily for escape from predators rather than for pursuit of prey. And then there are the oviraptorids, the feathered theropods that have been found in some of the most remarkable fossil discoveries of the 20th century, sitting on nests of eggs in postures identical to modern birds incubating a clutch. The discovery of brooding oviraptorid specimens was one of the defining moments in our modern understanding of dinosaur behaviour. Clear, unambiguous evidence that at least some dinosaurs invested heavily in parental care, maintaining body contact with their eggs in the same way that birds do today. The image of an oviraptorid sitting on its nest, its arms spread wide, its feathered body covering the eggs. Its head alert and watchful is one that I find genuinely moving, because it is recognisable, because it is exactly what a bird would do, because it collapses the distance between the Cretaceous and the present in a way that the bones of predators and the fossils of sauropod teeth do not quite manage. Here is a parent. Here is an animal caring for its young, investing its time and energy and warmth in the next generation, in the most ancient and fundamental way that warm-blooded vertebrates have always done. Here is continuity with everything that has ever raised a family on this planet. The Cretaceous is not alien when you look at it this way. It is deeply, profoundly familiar. The full catalogue of Cretaceous dinosaurs, the named species, the described genera, the families and clades and lineages, runs to hundreds of species, with new ones being described every year. From Patagonia to Patagonia by way of everywhere in between. From the largest land animals to ever walk the earth to feathered hunters the size of ravens, from the armoured and the horned to the crested and the elegant, the dinosaurs were a radiation of extraordinary scope and variety. We have met only a few of them tonight. The rest wait in the rock, patient as only stone can be patient, not gone, just waiting to be found. One of the most compelling evolutionary stories in the entire history of life is the story of how flight evolved in the dinosaur lineage, how a group of small, feathered, ground-dwelling or tree-dwelling theropods gradually, over millions of years, arrived at the capacity for true powered flight and became what we now call birds. The story is still being actively written. New fossil discoveries from China, from Argentina, from other Cretaceous deposits around the world regularly add new chapters, new complications, new nuances to our understanding. What I can offer you tonight is our current best understanding, which is remarkable in what it has achieved even as it acknowledges what remains uncertain. The key innovation was, of course, the wing. But the wing, in the early stages of bird evolution, was not a wing in the modern aeronautical sense. The feathered forelimbs of the earliest birdline theropods were not capable of generating sufficient lift for powered flight. They were something else, perhaps used for balance during fast running, perhaps for gliding from elevated perches, perhaps for display, perhaps for prey capture. One fascinating hypothesis that has gained empirical support in recent years is the __1_10__idea. Research on modern birds has shown that wing flapping can be used to stabilize animals running up inclines, allowing them to press their bodies against a steep surface and maintain traction even on near-vertical substrates. Some researchers have proposed that proto-wings in small feathered dinosaurs served a similar function, enabling them to run up steep surfaces, the trunks of trees, rocky slopes, with greater efficiency, and that the transition from incline running to flight proceeded via the arboreal gliding hypothesis, with animals beginning to glide from elevated positions before developing the full-powered flight apparatus. The counter-hypothesis, the __quote _11 model, proposes that flight evolved from the ground, through a progression from fast running to leaping, to incipient gliding to full flight, without the intermediate arboreal stage. This model is also supported by some evidence and has its own proponents. The honest answer is that flight probably evolved in a mosaic pattern, different aspects of the flight apparatus evolving somewhat independently in animals that were already using their feathered limbs for multiple functions, with the full flight system emerging from a complex interaction of different selective pressures acting on different aspects of the anatomy simultaneously. What we can say with confidence is that by the early Cretaceous, there were animals in the theropod lineage that were genuinely capable of gliding or even powered flight. Microraptor from the Yixian Formation had feathered wings on both its forelimbs and hind limbs, and aerodynamic analysis suggests it was capable of sustained gliding, possibly with some powered component. Archaeopteryx from the late Jurassic had a mosaic of dinosaurian and avian characters that places it near the transition to true birds. By 100 million years ago, our moment in the story, the Enantiornithines and other early bird groups had moved significantly beyond the Archaeopteryx grade of organization. They had the asymmetric flight feathers that indicate the aerodynamic sophistication needed for true, controlled flight. They had the keeled sternum that in modern birds provides attachment for the large flight muscles. They were, in the full functional sense, birds, and yet they retained some features that modern birds do not have. Claws on their wing fingers, teeth in some lineages, fused skeletal elements in different configurations than modern birds. They were birds, but early birds, experimental birds, birds still exploring the possibilities of the avian body plan that their descendants would develop and refine over the tens of millions of years to follow. The evolution of flight is, in some ways, the most dramatic example of a theme that runs through all of evolutionary biology, the gradual transformation of function. A structure that begins as something relatively simple, used for one purpose, accumulates small modifications over generation after generation until it is performing a completely different function with an effectiveness that seems miraculous but is, in fact, the cumulative result of an almost incomprehensible number of small improvements. Feathers for warmth became feathers for display, became feathers for gliding, became feathers for flight. The same basic structure, elaborated and refined over millions of years, serving successively more demanding purposes, each step small, each step possible. The destination, a creature that can sustain itself in the air, navigate thousands of miles of ocean, hover with precision before a flower, emerging from the accumulation of those small steps over geological time. It is one of the most extraordinary facts about the world. That process, blind, without intention, without foresight, responding only to immediate selective pressures, can produce such outcomes. That the cumulative result of millions of small, undirected changes can be something as magnificent and as precisely engineered as a bird in flight. I never stop finding this astonishing. I hope you don't either. Deep in the Cretaceous world, at a level far below the visible, below the scale of cells even, the ancient chemistry of life was running its patient, precise operations. The molecules of life, DNA, RNA, proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, were not fundamentally different 100 million years ago from what they are today. The genetic code, that arbitrary-seeming mapping of nucleotide triplets to amino acids, was already fixed in essentially its modern form long before the Cretaceous. The basic metabolic pathways, glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, oxidative phosphorylation, were ancient beyond the Cretaceous, already running in the earliest eukaryotes of the Precambrian. This biochemical conservatism is one of the most remarkable facts about life. Across more than 3 billion years of evolution, through every mass extinction and climate change and continental rearrangement, the fundamental molecular machinery of the cell has remained essentially the same. The same nucleotides, the same amino acids, the same coenzymes, the same ion channels and membrane lipids and ribosomal structures. A Cretaceous bacterium would have used the same genetic code as the bacteria living in your gut right now. A Cretaceous plant cell would have performed photosynthesis through the same chain of molecular reactions as a modern plant cell. A Cretaceous mammal's muscles would have converted ATP to mechanical work through the same sliding filament mechanism as your own muscles do as you breathe. At the molecular level, the Cretaceous is not distant at all. It is here, in every cell of every living thing on Earth. The same ancient chemistry, running in the same ancient way, in new containers, new organisms, new species, new ecological arrangements, but using the same molecular toolkit that was already perfected before there were any animals at all. There is something extraordinary about this. The molecules that build and run our bodies are 100 times older than the dinosaurs. They are not Cretaceous, they are Precambrian. They carry within their structure the history of life at its most fundamental level, a history written not in stone, but in the precise three-dimensional architecture of molecular machinery that natural selection has been refining since before the oxygen revolution. Before the first multicellular organism, before anything that we would recognize as life in any conventional sense. We are made of ancient things, not just the calcium in our bones which was forged in stars billions of years ago, but the chemistry of our cells, the molecular machinery that maintains our lives moment to moment, is an inheritance from depths of time so great that the Cretaceous itself seems recent in comparison. The Spinosaurus that waded through the ancient rivers of North Africa was built of the same molecular building blocks as you are. Its DNA used the same 4 nucleotides. Its cells maintained their internal environment through the same ion pumps. Its muscles contracted through the same molecular mechanism. At the level of basic biochemistry, you and Spinosaurus are kin, distant kin, separated by 165 million years of evolutionary divergence, but kin nonetheless. The same life. In different packages. Life is not a collection of different things. It is one thing, endlessly varied. One ancient, molecular, biochemically conservative, astonishingly creative process, running on this small planet for nearly 4 billion years, producing wonders from amoebas to ecosystems to the self-aware primate reading these words tonight. That is what you are. That is what has always been living on this planet. That is what the Cretaceous was. Not a different kind of life, but the same life in earlier forms in a different world. There is a concept that I want to approach carefully tonight, because it feels important and also difficult to articulate. It is the concept of home, of what it means for a living creature to belong to a particular world, to be fitted to its climate, its ecology, its chemistry, its seasonal rhythms, in the way that every Cretaceous creature was fitted to its world. The titanosaur didn't choose to live in the Cretaceous. It was born into it, as its parents had been born into it, as its lineage had been born into earlier versions of it going back tens of millions of years. It knew no other world. The particular weight of the Cretaceous air, the particular chemistry of the vegetation, the particular patterns of wet season and dry, the particular predators in the shadows, all of this was simply the world, simply reality, simply home. And in that fitness, in the deep, evolutionary fit between creature and world, there is something that I think we're right to call belonging. Not conscious belonging, not the felt sense of being at home that we experience when we return to a familiar place, but biological belonging, the fit between organism and environment that is the very definition of ecological adaptation. Every creature in the Cretaceous world belonged to it in this way. The mosasaur belonged to the warm Cretaceous sea. The ammonite belonged to the water column it drifted through. The small mammal belonged to the Cretaceous night, with its particular predation pressure and its particular acoustic and olfactory landscape. Every organism was a solution to the specific problem of living in the Cretaceous world, and the Cretaceous world was, in some real sense, the problem that those organisms had spent millions of years solving. When the asteroid struck, what was lost, beyond the individual organisms, beyond the species, beyond the entire ecological communities, was that belonging, that ancient accumulated fit between creature and world. The world changed, catastrophically and rapidly, faster than we evolution could respond. And the creatures that had been so perfectly fitted to their world were stranded. not in their world anymore, but in a new one that they had not spent millions of years learning to inhabit. The survivors were the ones who, by chance or by the character of their biology, could inhabit both worlds. The birds with their warm blood and their flexibility, the crocodilians with their ability to go without food for months, the mammals with their general adaptability and their warm blood and their willingness to eat almost anything, the insects with their extraordinarily rapid generation times allowing fast evolutionary response to changed conditions. These were not better organisms in any absolute sense. They were organisms that happened to carry in their biology the specific traits that would prove useful in the specific chaos of the immediate post-impact world. They were lucky, and their luck, or more precisely, the accident of their biological attributes matching the requirements of a catastrophically changed world, is the reason the world eventually recovered and diversified again. We are here because of that luck, because the right things survived. Because life's extraordinary creativity, given enough time, was able to rebuild a rich and complex world from the survivors of a catastrophe. And now we inhabit that rebuilt world. We belong to it in exactly the way that the titanosaur belonged to the Cretaceous, fitted to it by millions of years of evolutionary history, dependent on it for everything we need, carrying within us the traces of all the worlds that came before it. We are creatures of our world, and our world is a gift, a rebuilt, renewed, post-apocalyptic gift from all the worlds that preceded it, including the Cretaceous, including tonight's world of ancient rivers and warm seas and great feathered dinosaurs and tiny patient mammals waiting for their turn. The world gave us that, gave all of that, and we are here, improbably and beautifully, to receive it. I want to end our long evening with a thought about the fossils themselves, not what they contain, not what they reveal about specific species or ecological communities, but what they mean, what the fact of their existence tells us. A fossil is a coincidence, an extraordinary, unlikely, beautiful coincidence. For an organism to become a fossil, many things must go right in sequence. First, the organism must die in a place where rapid burial is possible, near water, in a sedimentary environment where sediment can cover the remains quickly enough to prevent complete decomposition. Second, the burial must happen quickly enough that at least some hard parts are preserved before they break down. Third, over millions of years, the right chemical conditions must exist to allow mineralization, the gradual replacement of organic molecules with mineral ones, to occur. Fourth, the fossilized remains must survive the geological processes that would otherwise destroy them: pressure, heat, tectonic deformation. Fifth, they must eventually be brought close enough to the surface by erosion or tectonic uplift that they can be found. Sixth, they must be found before erosion destroys them. Each of these steps is improbable. The coincidence of all of them occurring for the same organism is extraordinary. The vast majority of organisms that have ever lived left no fossil record whatsoever. They lived, they died, they decomposed completely, and they vanished from the record of existence without trace, which means that every fossil we find is a survivor, not a survivor in the biological sense. The organism died millions of years ago, but a survivor in the geological and informational sense. Out of all the countless trillions of individuals that lived in the Cretaceous world, a tiny, vanishingly small fraction left any trace at all. And of those traces, an even smaller fraction has survived to the present, and of those survivors, only those that happen to be exposed at a surface that humans have looked at have been found. When you hold a fossil, when a paleontologist lifts a fragment of dinosaur bone from the rock and turns it in their hands, they are holding something against all odds, something that had no business surviving 100 million years, and yet did. A message in a bottle thrown from the deck of an ancient world, carried by unimaginable currents to your hands. The message is this: I was here, I was real, I lived. And the appropriate response, I think, is gratitude. Not sentimental gratitude, not the feeling of owing something to a long-dead animal, but something more like reverence. The fossil earned its survival through a series of coincidences that we can only marvel at. It crossed time in a way that nothing else from its world did. It chose us, or we chose it, and in that choosing, in that moment of discovery and recognition, the creature that made it came back, briefly, imperfectly, movingly, to the world of the living. This is what science is at its best. Not a cold and clinical extraction of data from nature, but a relationship between the curious mind and the patient evidence, between the present and the past, between the living and the ancient dead. A conversation across time that neither party fully controls. The Cretaceous world is speaking to us through its fossils. It has been speaking to us since the first human picked up an ammonite and wondered where it came from. It will continue speaking to us as long as there are people willing to listen. Tonight, we have listened. We have heard what we could hear. We have imagined what could not be heard. The sounds of an ancient morning, the feel of warm Cretaceous air, the weight of time. And perhaps that imagining, however incomplete and imperfect, is its own kind of gratitude, its own way of honouring the world that came before us, its own way of saying, I know you were here, I know you were real, I know you lived, and I am grateful. The journey is ending now. The ancient world is receding. The titanosaurs are returning to the shadows. The warm Cretaceous sea is pulling back its light. The pterosaurs are folding their wings and disappearing into the deep time from which we called them. The small mammals are withdrawing into their burrows. The rivers are going still, and what remains is here. This room. This night. Your body, heavy and comfortable, doing what bodies have always done when the day's work is done and the dark has come, settling, releasing, letting go. You have travelled a long way tonight, across 100 million years, across seas that no longer exist and through forests of trees that have turned to coal. You have stood at the feet of the world's largest land animals and watched the world's first birds learning to fly. You have breathed imaginary air that no lungs have breathed for 66 million years. Now let all of that vast distance fold back into the present. Let the ancient world become, again, the rock beneath the modern world's foundations. Let the dinosaurs lie down in their final rest. Let the Cretaceous seas drain back into the sediment that remembers them, and let yourself be here, simply here, in the warmth and the quiet of this ordinary, extraordinary moment. Your body is warm. That warmth is an ancient inheritance, the same biochemistry that kept small Cretaceous mammals warm in the cold of the Mesozoic night. Your breath is slow and even. Every breath you take is made partly of carbon that has passed, over the long years, through the bodies of ancient creatures, through ferns and dinosaurs and the microscopic algae of warm Cretaceous seas. You are connected to all of it. You always were. You always will be. Let your eyes be still. Let your thoughts soften at the edges and grow indistinct, the way the features of a distant landscape blur as the light fades. Let the day's concerns recede to their proper distance. Real, yes, requiring attention tomorrow, but not urgent now. Not necessary now. Now is for rest. Now is for the ancient, patient, necessary work of sleep. The work that every warm-blooded creature has always done when the night has come, from the first small mammal to the last human being who will ever close their eyes. You are part of that continuity. You are participating in something ancient and simple and good. The world is very old, and it has always known how to hold the living things that inhabit it, through the dark hours until the light returns. It is holding you now. Sleep. Rest now, in the quiet. The ancient world is waiting, patient as stone, as it has always waited for those who want to visit it. It will be there tomorrow. It will always be there. For tonight, let the stone dream its long dreams, and let yourself drift down into your own. Good night. I want to take a moment, a longer moment than we have taken before, to think about how we actually know the things I've been telling you tonight, because the knowledge itself is remarkable. The fact that human beings can reconstruct with real fidelity the appearance and behaviour and ecology of a world that ended 66 million years ago is not obvious. It requires explanation. It is one of the great intellectual achievements of our species, and it deserves to be appreciated as such. The primary tool is the fossil record. We have talked about fossils as individual objects, the bones, the shells, the impressions, the amber inclusions. But the fossil record is also a system, a vast global archive of biological information accumulated over hundreds of millions of years in the rocks of every continent. Learning to read that record is the work of paleontology. and it requires skills and knowledge that range from field geology to comparative anatomy, to chemistry to biomechanics to evolutionary biology. The geologist's first task is to establish the age of the rocks. How old is this layer? How old is this fossil? The tools for this, primarily radiometric dating, which uses the known decay rates of radioactive isotopes to calculate the age of rocks formed from volcanic material, were developed in the 20th century and revolutionized our understanding of geological time. Before radiometric dating, geologists could determine the relative age of rocks. This layer is older than that one, but not the absolute age. Radiometric dating gave us the numbers. The Cretaceous ended 66 million years ago, not a vague, long time ago, but a specific measurable interval. The chemistry of ancient rocks and fossils provides a second source of information. Stable isotopes of carbon, oxygen, strontium, and other elements record information about the environment in which they were deposited. The ratio of oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 in an ancient shell, for instance, is sensitive to the temperature of the water in which the shell formed. Because the heavier isotope is incorporated slightly more readily into mineral at lower temperatures. By measuring these ratios in fossil shells from different ages and locations, paleoclimatologists can reconstruct ancient ocean temperatures with surprising precision. Carbon isotopes carry information about ancient carbon cycles, including the productivity of ancient ecosystems and the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere. Sulfur isotopes record information about ocean chemistry and the activity of sulfur metabolizing bacteria. Nitrogen isotopes tell us about ancient food webs and nutrient cycles. Every element that becomes incorporated into a mineral or fossil carries some chemical memory of the conditions under which it was deposited, and learning to read those memories is the work of geochemistry. Comparative anatomy, the systematic comparison of fossil bones with those of living animals, is the foundation of our understanding of what ancient animals looked like and how they moved. The principle of homology, that structurally similar bones in different species reflect their shared ancestry, allows paleontologists to identify the specific bones in a fossil skeleton, even when the proportions are very different from any modern animal. The femur of a titanosaur is recognizably a femur because it shares the fundamental architecture of femurs across all vertebrates, even though its absolute size and proportions are unlike any femur alive today. Biomechanical analysis takes anatomy one step further, using the principles of physics and engineering to analyze how ancient animals actually functioned. How did a titanosaur's skeleton support its enormous weight? What was the range of motion of a Spinosaurus's limbs? How fast could a tyrannosaur run? These questions are answered by careful analysis of bone structure, muscle attachment points, and the physics of moving large masses through space. The answers are not always certain. Biomechanics requires assumptions, and different assumptions can lead to different conclusions, but they constrain our understanding in ways that pure anatomy cannot. Ichnology, the study of fossil tracks and traces, provides information about behavior that the bones themselves cannot. A fossil skeleton tells you what an animal was built like. A trackway tells you how it actually moved. The stride length, the step width, the pressure distribution within the footprint, all of these record the movement of a living animal in ways that the dead bones cannot. Tracks also provide ecological information. Which direction were animals moving? Were they in groups? Were they running or walking? Did their paths intersect with the tracks of predators? And increasingly, biochemical analysis of fossil material, extracting and analyzing organic molecules preserved in the mineral matrix of fossils, is providing information that could never have been obtained from anatomy alone. Melanosomes, the small cellular structures that contain pigment, have been preserved in some fossil feathers, allowing researchers to infer the colours of some feathered dinosaurs with some confidence. Proteins have been extracted from some fossil bones. The structural protein collagen, extraordinarily stable, has survived in some specimens for tens of millions of years, providing direct molecular evidence of evolutionary relationships. Each of these approaches has its limitations. Each requires assumptions and simplifications. Each can be misapplied or overinterpreted. The history of paleontology is full of confident reconstructions that were later overturned by new evidence. The Spinosaurus story, which I told you earlier, is a perfect example. The semi-aquatic interpretation of this animal was not proposed with confidence until new material was discovered and analysed with new techniques in the 2000s, fundamentally changing a reconstruction that had been essentially static for decades. But in aggregate, in the accumulated, cross-checked, multiply-corroborated body of evidence from fossils and chemistry, and comparative biology and trackways and amber and all the other sources of ancient information, we have built a picture of the Cretaceous world that is genuinely, substantially true. Not complete. It will never be complete. Not perfect. Every reconstruction involves simplifying assumptions and gaps in the evidence. But true in its broad outlines, true in its major ecological and evolutionary claims, true in the way that any great scientific theory is true, not as final certainty, but as the best current understanding, always subject to revision in the light of new evidence. And that revisability, that openness to change, that willingness to overturn cherished interpretations when the evidence demands it, is not a weakness of science. It is its greatest strength. The Cretaceous world as we understand it today is better, more accurate, more richly detailed than the Cretaceous world as it was understood 50 years ago. The world of 50 years from now will be better still. The conversation continues. The rock continues to speak. We continue to listen. Within the Cretaceous world that we have been visiting tonight, already present, already taking shape, already making its first tentative moves toward dominance, were the seeds of our own world. Not metaphorical seeds, literal ones in some cases. The seeds of the first flowering plants, pressing themselves into the Cretaceous soil at the feet of the dinosaurs, waiting for conditions that would allow their descendants to inherit the Earth. I want to spend a little time thinking about these harbingers, the things in the Cretaceous world that were, in retrospect, the future. Because there is something in this perspective, the future present in the past, already underway, already inevitable in some statistical sense, that I find profoundly comforting at a particular hour of the night. The angiosperms, the flowering plants. In the Cretaceous world, they were a minority group, growing in disturbed habitats and along waterways, experimenting with the business of producing flowers and recruiting insect pollinators. They were innovative, certainly. They were diversifying rapidly. But they had not yet achieved the ecological dominance that they would eventually reach in the post-Cretaceous world. The great forests were still gymnosperm forests. The dominant vegetation of the Cretaceous landscape was still defined by the ancient lineages, the conifers, the cycads, the ferns, and yet. Within the experimental diversity of those early Cretaceous angiosperms, within the exploratory range of flowers and fruits and seeds that evolution was producing in that first great radiation, were the ancestors of everything that defines the botanical landscape of the modern world, the ancestors of the oak and the apple, the ancestors of wheat and rice and corn, the ancestors of the rose and the lotus and the water lily, the ancestors of every hardwood forest, every meadow, every prairie, every tropical rainforest. They were there, small, experimental, mostly marginal, but there, and the insects that were beginning to co-evolve with them, the early bees and early butterflies, the first moths exploring the possibility of nectar as a food source. Those lineages too were in the Cretaceous. Setting up the partnerships that would eventually become so central to the functioning of terrestrial ecosystems that most of the world's vegetation would come to depend on them. The birds were there, diversifying in their early experimental forms. Within the diversity of those Cretaceous birds, the Enantiornithines and their contemporaries were the lineages that would eventually survive the extinction and radiate into the modern bird world. Some of those Cretaceous lineages would go on to become the songbirds, the shorebirds, the waterfowl, the raptors, the parrots. The potential was already present in the Cretaceous, even if its full expression was tens of millions of years in the future. The mammals were there, small and marginal and patient. Within that small, marginal, patient community of early mammals, the therians, with their live birth and their extended parental investment, were the ancestors of everything. The ancestor of the elephant and the mouse, the ancestor of the whale and the bat, the ancestor of the cat and the dog and the horse and the human. The potential for us was present in the Cretaceous world, carried in the warm bodies of creatures that ran through the undergrowth at our feet, avoiding the dinosaurs, eating insects and seeds, raising their young with such extraordinary care. We were there in potential 100 million years ago. The path from those small mammals to the creature reading these words tonight was not a straight line, not inevitable, not predetermined. It required a mass extinction and an enormous amount of evolutionary contingency and more luck than we probably deserve. But the raw material was there, the ancestor was there, and knowing this, holding this specific biological, evolutionary truth in your mind is a form of connection to the ancient world that no amount of fossil description can quite provide. You're connected to the Cretaceous not just through the chemical cycles and the atmospheric history and the geological inheritance. You are connected to it through an unbroken chain of biological reproduction. Through a succession of parents and offspring, generation after generation, going back without interruption to an ancestor that was alive in the world of the dinosaurs. Every generation in that chain was loved by its parents, or at least cared for in the mammalian way that care evolved to look like love. Every generation survived when it could easily not have. Every generation faced the dangers of its particular world and, enough of the time, made it through. From small mammals in the Cretaceous undergrowth to you, tonight. In the warmth and safety of your bed, that chain is real. That continuity is real. The love that began in the Mesozoic is real. The rocks of the Cretaceous have been lying in the earth for a very long time. The limestone of the English chalk downs was forming when Spinosaurus waded through African rivers. The shale of the American interior was settling to the floor of the Western Interior Seaway when mosasaurs patrolled its warm waters. The amber of Myanmar was flowing from ancient trees when the first ants were building their first colonies. And since the Cretaceous ended, those rocks have waited. They have been compressed by the weight of younger sediments deposited above them. They have been tilted and folded by tectonic forces. They have been slowly, incrementally eroded as the layers above them were worn away by water and wind and ice. They have been metamorphosed in some places by the heat and pressure of deep burial. They have been uplifted in mountain ranges and exposed in canyon walls and cut by the excavations of human mining operations. Through all of it, they have waited. And within them, the fossils have waited. Mineralized bones and shells, preserved in stone, carrying information about the living world of 100 million years ago through the full span of geological time, patient beyond any concept of patience that the living world can produce. Patience is perhaps the deepest characteristic of the geological world. Not a purposeful, intentional patience. The rock has no purposes, no intentions, but a kind of natural patience that arises from the simple fact of being composed of stable mineral matter that changes only very slowly under most conditions. The rock is patient because it cannot be impatient. And in that simple, physical patience, it has preserved what we needed it to preserve. I think about this sometimes when the world feels fast and urgent and relentlessly demanding of response. When the pace of things, the pace of information, of change, of events, feels overwhelming. At those times there is something genuinely settling about remembering that the rock is there, not going anywhere, not in a hurry, holding its fossils, its chemical records, its geological memory, with the same unhurried impassivity it has always maintained. The rock doesn't care about the pace of the modern world. It doesn't care about anything, and that indifference, that geological indifference to the urgency of the moment, is, paradoxically, comforting. It reminds you that the moment, however urgent it feels, is nested within a larger context of time that makes all moments equally temporary and equally brief. The Cretaceous moments felt urgent to the creatures living them. The mosasaur hunting a fish in the warm sea felt the urgency of hunger and the chase. The small mammal fleeing a predator felt the urgency of fear and the need for speed. These were real urgencies, matters of life and death in the immediate sense. And yet, from the perspective of the stone that now holds their fossilized remains, those urgencies are perfectly, completely equal to the stillness of the moment before them and the moment after. The stone is not cruel in this equalization. It is simply what stone is. It holds all moments with equal patience, differentiating not at all between urgency and calm. Between the hunt and the rest, between the last moment of the Cretaceous and the first moment of the Paleogene, and from that stone perspective, which is not available to us in our lives but which we can reach for in the quiet of a late night, the urgencies of the present moment are both completely real and completely temporary, both mattering and passing, both urgent and in the geological sense already over. Everything that feels permanent tonight will eventually become past. Everything that feels overwhelming will eventually become history. Every difficulty that seems like it will never end will, in geological time, have already ended. This is not a call to indifference or passivity. The difficulties of the present deserve our full engagement. The urgencies are real, but they are also passing. And knowing that they are passing, knowing that the stone is patient, that time is long, that every moment eventually settles into the geological record as just another layer, can give you a kind of steadiness that makes engagement possible without being consumed. The rock will still be there. The fossils will still be there. The ancient world will still be there, waiting in the stone for the next curious person who wants to visit it. You can rest now. The rock is patient. It can wait. There is a last thought I want to leave with you, as tonight draws to its final close. The light from the stars takes time to travel. The light from our closest stellar neighbour, Proxima Centauri, takes about 4 years to reach our eyes. The light from the bright stars of Orion takes between a few hundred and a few thousand years. The light from the most distant galaxies visible to the naked eye has been travelling for millions of years. When you look at the night sky, you are looking at the past. Each point of light is a time-delayed message from a distant source, the star itself. When the light you're seeing was emitted may have looked quite different from how it looks now. In some cases, the star no longer exists in the form you're seeing. The light reaching your eyes left a star that has since changed dramatically. You are seeing the past displayed in the present. 100 million years ago, on a clear Cretaceous night, the same stars that you would see tonight were in the sky, shifted slightly in their positions, as I mentioned earlier, by their proper motion through space, but mostly the same fundamental pattern, the same Milky Way, the same bright familiar points of light. And the light from those stars was falling on the Cretaceous world, falling on the backs of sleeping titanosaurs and the upturned faces of alert small mammals and the warm surface of the western interior seaway, illuminating in its faint and silver way a world that no human eye had yet evolved to see. That same light, not the same photons which long since struck the ground and were absorbed, but the same continuous output from the same stars. The same stream of photons from the same nuclear furnaces is still arriving, still falling. Tonight, right now, the light from the stars that shone on the Cretaceous is also shining on you. There is a kind of continuity in that image that I find profoundly settling. The universe is enormously old and enormously large, and most of what it contains is entirely indifferent to our existence. But within that vast indifference, there are these small threads of connection. The starlight that falls equally on all moments, the chemical cycles that connect the living to the ancient dead, the unbroken chain of biological inheritance that runs from the Cretaceous to tonight. You're not alone in time. You're embedded in it, woven through with it, connected by 1,000 invisible threads to every moment that has come before and every moment that will come after. The Cretaceous world is not behind a wall of time, inaccessible and alien. It is here. In the rock below your feet and the chemistry of your cells and the light of the stars above, it is here. You are here. And the night is here, old and quiet and full of the kind of patience that only very old things possess. Rest now. Let the ancient world hold you. Let the stars keep their long watch overhead. Let the river run. Let the stone be patient. Let yourself be small and warm and carried. It is enough. It has always been enough. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.